It begins in silence. No explosions, no battles, no flags waving in victory. Just trains, miles of them, packed with people who didn't know they were heading to their deaths. The air smells of smoke and lies. And somewhere deep in the forests of Poland, men in black uniforms are building something the world has never seen before, a factory designed not to create, but to erase. Names, faces, families, all scheduled for deletion. They called it Operation Reinhard, a name that sounded bureaucratic, clean, official. But behind those words was the most efficient murder machine ever conceived by man. This wasn't chaos. It was organization. It wasn't rage. It was planning. Men sat at desks and drew blueprints for death, calculating how many could die per hour, how much gold could be stolen from the mouths of corpses, how much ash could be buried before the earth itself began to bleed. And as those trains rolled through the mist, as station masters pretended not to see, as the guards laughed over lunch while smoke rose from the tree-line, a nation was being turned into an industry of extermination. What took place here didn't just kill millions. It rewired the definition of evil. Operation Reinhard wasn't a battle. It was a system, a machine that fed on silence and obedience. And once it started, there was no sound loud enough in the world to stop it. Chapter 1. The Blueprint of Extermination. It begins not with gunfire, but with pen strokes. Inside a quiet villa on the outskirts of Berlin, the air smelled of polished wood and cigarette smoke. A long oak table gleamed under chandelier light, its surface lined with folders, maps, and cups of strong black coffee. Outside, the frozen lake of Wannsee was covered in snow, silent, untouched, serene. Inside, men in crisp SS uniforms leaned over documents that would decide the fate of millions. They weren't screaming orders or marching soldiers. They were speaking in calm, measured tones about logistics, how to move human beings like freight. They called it the final solution. Adolf Eichmann, the man taking notes that day, scribbled with mechanical precision, his pen gliding as though he were drafting a shipping manifest. Around him sat the architects of extermination, Reinhard Heydrich, the ruthless deputy of the SS, and 15 senior bureaucrats from across the Nazi Empire. They spoke in euphemisms, resettlement, processing, special treatment, every word a disguise. But behind their polite phrasing lay something monstrous, the decision to annihilate every Jew within reach of German power. The world outside had no idea what was being planned. In January 1942, Europe was already choking under Nazi occupation. Ghettos were overcrowded. Starvation spread through Warsaw, Lublin, and Krakow. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads, had already murdered hundreds of thousands across the East. But bullets, as Himmler would later say, were inefficient, too slow, too messy, and too psychologically taxing on the executioners. The Nazis needed something colder, quieter, something industrial. That was the birth of Operation Reinhard, named in honor of Reinhard Heydrich, though he was still alive when it began. The plan was simple in structure, but horrifying in purpose: to eliminate the Jewish population of the general government, the occupied Polish territories, through an integrated network of extermination camps designed for one function only: death. Unlike concentration camps, these were not labor facilities. No forced work, no selection lines, no long-term survival. Only arrival, deception, extermination, and disposal. The men behind it understood that mass murder required order. Bureaucracy became their weapon. In Berlin, offices buzzed with clerks typing out deportation orders. At the Reich Main Security Office, charts were drawn to calculate how many train cars would be needed, how much fuel, how to stagger arrivals so that gas chambers wouldn't overcrowd. A genocide planned with the precision of a business operation. Odilo Globoknik, the SS and police leader of Lublin, was chosen to command it. A loyal Austrian Nazi, Globoknik had already proven his brutality during the invasion of Poland. Himmler gave him unlimited authority. His task: build 3 death camps, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, and coordinate the total liquidation of Polish Jewry. Each camp would be small, secret, and efficient, killing centers disguised as transit stations. At Globoknik's side was Christian Wirth, a veteran of the Nazi euthanasia program known as T4, where disabled Germans had been murdered under the guise of mercy. Wirth was methodical, cold, and creative in cruelty. He had supervised gas chambers disguised as showers in German asylums. Now he would perfect them in Poland. He was the first to call Belzec a factory of death, and he meant it literally. The SS engineers began with blueprints. Belzec would serve as a prototype. They chose a remote site near a railway line, close enough for transport, but far enough for secrecy. Trees were felled. Barbed wire was strung. Wooden barracks rose from the mud, and behind them, sealed gas chambers were built using lessons learned from T4, diesel engines instead of bottled gas. Cheaper, faster, easier to conceal. The killings would leave no witnesses. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Heydrich's network turned deportation into routine. Trains departed from Warsaw, Lublin, Krakow, and Radom, carrying thousands at a time. Jewish councils were ordered to prepare lists, often believing they were sending people for labor. The Nazis lied at every step. Families packed luggage, marked with chalk, hoping they'd reclaim it. They never would. The logistics of murder grew as complex as any military operation. The Reichsbahn, Germany's national railway, billed the SS for every passenger. Third-class fare, one way. Guards signed manifests. Station masters logged arrival times. To anyone glancing at the paperwork, it looked like normal transport administration. It was genocide disguised as efficiency. By early spring of 1942, the machinery of Operation Reinhard was nearly ready. The camps were not yet operational, but every cog was in place. Himmler's orders were clear. Secrecy was paramount. Guards were sworn to silence. Civilians nearby were threatened with death if they spoke of what they saw. Even within the SS, details were compartmentalized. Each officer knew only his small part of the larger design. The camps themselves were divided into zones. The reception area looked harmless. Fences, signs, even flower beds. Victims were told they'd be disinfected before work. They undressed, folded their clothes, and entered what looked like a bathhouse. The deception was so convincing that some went quietly, holding their children's hands. But once the doors closed, engines roared, and within minutes, silence fell again. The SS called it processing. Himmler's obsession was not just extermination. It was efficiency. He wanted numbers. Reports flowed daily. How many transported? How many treated? Globoknik developed special code words to mask the killing. Gold teeth and jewelry were cataloged and sent to the Reichsbank. Human hair was packed into sacks labeled textiles. The stolen wealth of the dead became part of the Nazi economy. But even within this monstrous bureaucracy, fear and rivalry thrived. Eichmann managed deportations, but resented Globoknik's growing power. Himmler micromanaged every aspect, ensuring that the operation remained under his direct control. Heydrich's influence loomed, though he would soon be assassinated in Prague in mid-1942. After his death, the name Operation Reinhard became both tribute and warning, the continuation of his vision. Across occupied Poland, ghettos began to empty. The Warsaw Ghetto, once home to hundreds of thousands, was choked by disease and starvation before the transports began. Each train that left was another thread cut from a dying community. Those who remained behind whispered rumors of camps in the east, of gas, of no return. But disbelief protected hope. Most could not imagine a system built solely to kill. In Lublin, the SS established their headquarters. There, surrounded by paperwork, typewriters, and maps, the operation took on its final form. Prisoners were forced to sort belongings from the murdered. Shoes, clothing, watches, all categorized. The efficiency of theft mirrored the efficiency of killing. Everything was documented, archived, stored. No waste, no evidence left uncounted. To keep the machinery turning, Globoknik employed a mixture of German officers, Ukrainian guards, and a handful of Jewish prisoners forced to maintain order. They built the rails, burned the bodies, and dug the graves. The Nazis called them Sonderkommandos, special units. Their existence was temporary. After weeks, they too were killed and replaced. It was extermination layered with cruelty. By mid-1942, the deportations began in full force. Trains arrived daily at Belzec, then Sobibor, then Treblinka. The speed was staggering. Entire towns vanished in days. In just 3 months, nearly 500,000 Jews were dead. The SS reported it as resettlement success. Himmler congratulated his officers, noting how orderly the process had become. The methods refined at Belzec spread quickly. Sobibor adopted larger gas chambers. Treblinka introduced faster cremation systems. Operation Reinhard became an assembly line of death, each camp improving upon the last. The victims changed, but the system remained constant. Deception, extermination, disposal, profit. The scale was hidden, but not invisible. Locals near the camps noticed the stench of burning flesh carried by the wind. Black ash settled on their roofs. Forest animals avoided the area. Trains arrived full and left empty. Yet silence reigned. Fear kept mouths shut. The SS had eyes everywhere. Inside the Nazi administration, reports circulated like business memos. Throughput was measured. Cost calculated. They spoke of expansion capacity, of transport efficiency. These were not soldiers. They were bureaucrats of annihilation. Each believed they were merely doing their job. That was the horror. Evil reduced to paperwork. Even Hitler's direct words were rare on the subject. He preferred distance, allowing his subordinates to act on the Führer's will. Himmler described it as a burden of duty, moral cleansing through obedience. At speeches to SS officers, he spoke of eliminating the Jewish question as though it were a sanitation task. Applause followed. By late 1942, Operation Reinhard had reached full efficiency. The camps operated seamlessly. Belzec alone had already claimed over 400,000 lives. Treblinka and Sobibor would soon surpass it. The network functioned like a dark mirror of modern industry. Schedules, quotas, supervisors, technical reports, all in service of death. And yet, within the Nazi hierarchy, whispers grew. Some officers feared the scale of killing would haunt them. Others saw opportunity, promotions, medals, wealth. Globoknik himself wrote proudly to Himmler about the success of our mission. In his words, success meant annihilation. The system was expanding, but so was the secrecy. The Nazi state began to destroy its own paper trail. Orders were verbal, reports coded, witnesses silenced. Even the men running the camps were warned never to speak of their work beyond the fences. They didn't need to. The smoke already spoke for them. As 1943 approached, the machinery of genocide was running at full speed, but cracks were beginning to show. The Soviet front was shifting. The tide of war was turning. And Himmler knew that if the Reich fell, the evidence of their crimes could not survive. Operation Reinhard had begun as a plan written in ink, drafted in the calm of a Berlin villa. It had become the largest, fastest, and most systematic mass murder operation in history. But as the trains continued to arrive and the ashes piled higher, the men who created it began to fear something they hadn't planned for, the reckoning that was coming. And deep inside Poland, hidden beyond the barbed wire and trees, the ground itself began to move, not from wind or rain, but from the weight of what it now contained. The world had not yet seen it, but soon it would. And when it did, the lie of silence would finally collapse under the truth buried beneath it. Chapter 2. The Architects of Death. It was a system built not just by orders, but by men, real men with faces, tempers, and ambitions. They weren't monsters from the start. They became monsters through choice, through loyalty, through the cold belief that their cruelty served a higher purpose. Operation Reinhard didn't simply appear overnight. It was engineered, layer by layer, by those who believed efficiency could sanctify murder. At its core stood the architects, Heinrich Himmler, Otto Globoknik, Christian Wirth, and a legion of bureaucrats who transformed ideology into action, paper into death. Heinrich Himmler was the nucleus. He was not a warrior. He was an organizer, a man who preferred silence over shouting, statistics over speeches. His eyes hid behind small round glasses, his voice even and polite, as though he were discussing agricultural policy instead of extermination. Yet he held the power of life and death over millions. Himmler's dream was of a racially purified empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Urals. He imagined a world where only those he deemed racially valuable would remain, and he considered it his sacred duty to cleanse the rest. To him, extermination was not brutality. It was hygiene. He called it a hard but necessary act. He believed that by erasing entire populations, he was protecting Germany's soul. That belief made him unstoppable. When Reinhard Heydrich was assassinated in Prague in June 1942, the Nazi hierarchy reeled. He had been the engine of planning, the man who made genocide administrative. But his death only deepened Himmler's resolve. In Heydrich's memory, Operation Reinhard would bear his name. It was both a tribute and a continuation, a promise to finish what the fallen SS general had begun. The killing machine would move forward with even greater purpose. To carry out the plan, Himmler turned to a trusted subordinate, Otto Globoknik, a man as ruthless as he was ambitious. A former construction worker turned Nazi zealot, Globoknik had already proven his loyalty. He had orchestrated mass expulsions in Poland and built forced labor projects in Lublin with military efficiency. But it was his cruelty that impressed Himmler most. Where others hesitated, Globoknik acted. Where others questioned, he obeyed. He was the perfect executor of policy, brutal, pragmatic, and unflinchingly loyal. Globoknik saw Operation Reinhard as his chance for redemption. Once disgraced for corruption, he now had the opportunity to climb back into Himmler's favor. His mission, to design and command a network of death that could annihilate the Jewish population of Poland. He assembled a team of killers, logisticians, and administrators, each one carefully chosen for his ability to obey without question. Among them was Christian Wirth, the man who would turn extermination into a science. Wirth was a police officer by training, an early member of the Nazi Party, and one of the first men to participate in the T4 euthanasia program. He had supervised the gassing of mentally ill Germans years before the war, using carbon monoxide chambers disguised as showers. He was the kind of man who took pride in precision. Cold, irritable, and obsessive about detail, Wirth treated death as a technical challenge. He once told subordinates, "We are not here to hate. We are here to cleanse." To him, killing wasn't emotional. It was procedural. And that mindset made him invaluable. Wirth brought his experience from T4 to Poland, applying the lessons of domestic euthanasia to mass extermination. He understood how to deceive victims, how to construct chambers that killed efficiently, how to maintain secrecy. Under his direction, Belzec became the prototype for industrialized murder. He ordered gas chambers built of concrete, fitted with airtight doors and disguised as bathhouses. Victims were herded inside under the illusion of sanitation. Diesel engines pumped exhaust fumes into the sealed rooms. In less than half an hour, hundreds could be killed. It was faster than bullets, quieter than firing squads, and less psychologically taxing for the SS guards. The men who followed Wirth learned to adapt. Franz Stangl, a tall Austrian officer with pale hair and calm eyes, arrived to assist in Belzec and later command Sobibor and Treblinka. Stangl was not a sadist. He was something far worse, a man who killed through efficiency, not emotion. He once compared the extermination process to running a production line. His detachment allowed him to oversee genocide without hesitation. He believed he was simply managing a system. Behind these commanders worked the bureaucrats, the faceless men who made genocide possible from desks hundreds of miles away. Adolf Eichmann, head of Jewish affairs at the Reich Main Security Office, was the master of logistics. He coordinated train schedules, negotiated with railway officials, and ensured the transports arrived on time. He knew exactly where each train was going and what awaited its passengers, but he treated the information like data. His office recorded every shipment, every arrival, every death, and filed it under resettlement. When questioned years later, Eichmann would claim he was only following orders. But his precision turned those orders into action. Without him, the machine would have stalled. Other administrators filled the gaps. Richard Tamala, a construction expert, oversaw the building of camps. He made sure the gas chambers were airtight, the fences high, the rail lines connected directly to unloading platforms. He was meticulous, sketching blueprints late into the night. To him, it was just another engineering project. The SS called it special construction work. In reality, it was the architecture of annihilation. The network spread like roots through occupied Poland. From Berlin came the policies. From Lublin came the orders. From the camps came the smoke. The chain of command was clean, efficient, and deliberate. Every man knew his role. There was no need for emotional speeches, no passion. The system thrived on procedure, on formality, on the illusion of normalcy. But beneath the calm, there was competition. Globoknik sought Himmler's approval, eager to prove that his operation could outpace any other. Wirth demanded more resources, better equipment, faster trains. The commanders competed in killing rates, boasting about how many units they had processed. Reports compared figures like production quotas. The language of industry masked the language of death. Each of these men built his own moral cage to survive. Some convinced themselves they were serving their country. Others believed they were preventing disease or decay. Most simply stopped thinking. Within the SS, obedience was sacred. Questioning orders meant weakness. Those who hesitated were replaced. Those who refused were shot. The structure of command left no space for doubt. Globoknik's headquarters in Lublin became the nerve center of extermination. From there, messages flowed to and from the camps. Couriers arrived daily with reports, train schedules, fuel requests, body counts. The air in his office was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of typewriter ink. Maps covered the walls, pins marking ghetto locations, arrows tracing rail lines toward Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. His staff worked long hours, recording every detail. Each piece of paper represented thousands of lives, but none of them thought about that. They thought only of efficiency. Himmler visited often, touring the sites with detached curiosity. Witnesses later recalled how he watched the killing process at Belzec without emotion. When the bodies were cleared, he merely nodded and said, "This is a tough job, but it must be done." That phrase, cold, bureaucratic, absolute, became a kind of prayer for the SS. They repeated it to themselves whenever the screams got too loud. Christian Wirth took pride in improving methods. He insisted that victims be treated calmly to avoid panic. He ordered guards to use soothing voices, to arrange fake medical stations and waiting rooms. He even had flowers planted near the reception areas to give a false sense of security. Everything was calculated to maintain order. He once scolded a subordinate for being too rough, saying, "We must make them believe they are safe. Only then can we work efficiently." But beneath his surface composure, Wirth was volatile. He was known for sudden explosions of rage. He beat subordinates for mistakes, sometimes shooting them on the spot. To him, incompetence was treason. His reputation spread quickly through the camps. Prisoners feared him, and even SS officers kept their distance. He was called the Wild Christian, yet his methods worked. The death toll soared. As the machinery of Operation Reinhard grew, it required more manpower. Himmler approved the recruitment of Ukrainian auxiliaries, former Soviet POWs trained at the Treblinka camp near Lublin. These men became the guards, the shooters, the enforcers. They were promised better food, pay, and survival. Many joined willingly. They manned the watchtowers, dragged victims to chambers, burned bodies in open pits. To the SS, they were expendable tools, but to the victims, they were the last faces seen before death. Meanwhile, the German public knew almost nothing. The press spoke of resettlement, evacuation, and security measures. Propaganda film showed Jews being relocated to the east for work. The reality was hidden behind euphemisms. Only a handful of officials knew the full scope, and they guarded it fiercely. Silence was as important as the gas itself. Among the bureaucrats, a peculiar detachment developed, a sense of professional pride in the organization's smooth functioning. Reports praised increased throughput, improved deception techniques, and optimized burial processes. The language was clean, efficient, and entirely devoid of humanity. It was genocide translated into office jargon. Yet cracks occasionally appeared. Some officers drank heavily, unable to cope with what they saw. Others transferred to different postings, citing ill health. A few confessed to priests, though the church remained largely silent. Most simply buried their conscience beneath orders. In their minds, responsibility belonged to Himmler, to Hitler, to fate, anywhere but to themselves. Eichmann continued to refine deportation schedules. He liaised with the railways, negotiating timetables so that no transport would delay another. He joked that the trains carrying Jews always run on time. To him, precision was virtue. To the victims, it was damnation. Within the camps, commandants competed to impress their superiors. Franz Stangl introduced stricter routines at Sobibor, daily roll calls, timed executions, reduced fuel waste. At Treblinka, new cremation pits replaced mass graves to handle the growing number of corpses. The operation had entered its peak phase. Every improvement meant more deaths per hour. The architects of death were perfecting their design. But perfection brought new problems. The stench from the camps spread for miles. Train conductors complained. Locals whispered. Even some German soldiers were disturbed by what they saw. Rumors reached Berlin, but Himmler dismissed them. "It is necessary," he said. "The world will thank us one day." His faith in his mission was absolute. In meetings, he spoke of future generations who would live in racial purity. He imagined farms, forests, and cities built over the ashes of the murdered. He called it building a new Europe. To him, Operation Reinhard was not an atrocity, it was construction. That delusion drove him forward. By the end of 1942, the hierarchy was fully entrenched. Himmler ruled from Berlin, Globoknik from Lublin, Wirth from the camps. Each man operated within his sphere, bound by secrecy and ambition. Together they formed a triangle of power that governed life and death for millions. Orders flowed down, reports flowed up, and the killing never stopped. Yet, even as they perfected the machinery, something else began to stir within the Nazi ranks. A creeping awareness that the war might not end as they expected. The Eastern Front was bleeding. Soviet forces were pushing west. Supplies were running thin. The architects of death began to realize their creation might one day be exposed. Himmler ordered increased secrecy. Documents were destroyed. Witnesses executed. The camps continued to run, but plans for concealment were already in motion. Globoknik began discussing Sonderaction 1005, a future operation to exhume and burn bodies to erase evidence. Even while they killed, they were planning how to hide the proof. In the offices of Lublin, Globoknik's staff worked late into the night. The sound of typewriters filled the air. They were processing new arrivals, new deportation lists, new directives. The war outside raged on, but inside those walls, the machinery of genocide remained focused, relentless, exact. Paper, ink, and signatures became instruments of death. Every document that left that office was a death warrant disguised as administration. Christian Wirth continued to move between camps, enforcing discipline. He drove himself across muddy roads, inspecting every detail: door seals, gas flow, burial sites. He spoke little, smiled less, and kept his pistol visible. He was the ghost that haunted every camp under his command. To his men, he was terrifying. To Himmler, invaluable. Eichmann visited occasionally, watching trains unload. He described later how he felt nothing special, only curiosity at how efficiently it all worked. That was the essence of Operation Reinhard. Murder made mechanical, conscience replaced by calculation. As winter set in, the killings continued. But beneath the surface, the architects began to sense the fragility of their creation. They had built a system so vast, so efficient, that it could not easily be undone. It depended on silence, secrecy, and absolute victory. Without those, it would collapse and take them with it. And so they worked faster, killing as though time itself were the enemy. They believed the future belonged to them, that history would forget the details, that the world would move on. But the smoke rising from the forests of Poland told another story, a story that could not be buried forever. They had built the blueprint of extermination. Now they would watch as it spread across Europe, swallowing everything in its path. Yet what they didn't know, not yet, was that within the very camps they designed, a spark of resistance was already forming. A whisper among prisoners. A plan that would one day shatter the silence they so carefully built. Chapter 3. Lublin. The Command Center Genocide. The town of Lublin smelled of coal smoke and wet earth. But beneath that ordinary scent there was another odor. Ink on paper, the metallic tang of typewriter ribbon, the faint, clinical bleach of offices that never closed. In early 1942, Lublin was chosen not for its grandeur, but for its utility, rail junctions, proximity to the eastern ghettos, and a network of quiet roads threading through dense forests. It was small enough to hide the machinery of murder and large enough to coordinate it. Here, in offices that looked like any other wartime bureaucracy, men drew maps with pinpoints that meant death. Tractors and wagons moved under orders that began as a signature in Berlin and ended in smoke. The city itself became a hinge on which the entire Reinhard operation turned. Walk into the SS headquarters on a winter morning, and you would have seen nothing dramatic. A guard at the door, a clipboard, the muffled clack of typewriters. But the air inside was taut with purpose. Cigarettes passed between officers, coffee cups sat in neat rows, and piles of forms waited to be stamped. Each stamp was a command. Each command moved trains. Each train moved people. In one narrow room, a clerk matched ghetto lists to railway timetables with the same calm concentration a surgeon might give to a diagram. The contrast between the ordinariness of the scene and the enormity of its consequence was a cruelty of its own. The choice of Lublin as a nerve center had been deliberate. From there the SS could direct transports from Warsaw, Lodz, Białystok, and smaller towns where Jews had been corralled into ghettos. The rail lines that converged on the city were arteries. Globoknik and his staff treated them like a vascular system, calculating capacity, flow, and timing. Railway schedules were negotiated not as national infrastructure, but as instruments of annihilation. The Reichsbahn issued invoices. The SS paid them. In the ledger was travel. In reality, it was the logistics of mass death. Majdanek, on the edge of Lublin, offered both utility and disguise. Ostensibly a labor camp, it served a dual purpose, a place of forced work and a holding area for people destined for further transit. From its fences one could see the forest line beyond, a place where smoke sometimes rose like a dark column on the horizon. Majdanek was a hub. Supplies for camps were stockpiled there, materials were sorted, and when the killing network needed manpower or space, Majdanek supplied both. Trains arrived with people, and sometimes they left with fewer than they had brought. The camp's buildings echoed with the noise of work, hammers, saws, boots, and under that noise, the quiet machinery of death hummed. Inside Lublin's command rooms, the men in charge argued in clipped tones about capacity and concealment. Globoknik, who had grown into his role like a man settling into well-worn boots, paced maps with the impatience of a field commander. He wanted speed and secrecy. He wanted the camps to be small enough to be overlooked and efficient enough to be invisible in statistical reports. Christian Worth, when present, prowled the blueprints like a man inspecting a machine. He insisted that reception areas look welcoming, signage, fake medical stations, even benches, so that panic would not break the flow. The deception was a technical problem to be solved. So was the disposal of bodies. They discussed pits and crematoria with the same jargon one might use in municipal planning: capacity, throughput, fuel consumption. At street level, the people of Lublin watched with a complicated mixture of ignorance, fear, and dread. Some sensed odd trains, different timetables. Shopkeepers noticed uniforms they did not recognize. Farmhands noticed wagons coming from the direction of ghettos, empty by the time they returned. Rumors circulated about work camps, about deportation, about resettlement. But fear kept conversation low and eyes averted. The SS had ways of reminding people that silence was safer. One whispered question could mean a prison cell, a beating, or worse. So the town adapted its ordinary life to extraordinary orders. Bakeries continued to bake. Trams still clanged their routes. Children still argued over chalk on sidewalks. The outward rhythms of life were a shelter for the secret within. The technical heart of the operation was not military hardware, but paperwork. Every transport needed a manifest. Every arrival needed a report. In a cramped office, a clerk would unpack a bundle of lists from a ghetto Judenrat, names, ages, occupations, and translate it into a schedule. Sometimes the Jewish councils were compelled to provide the list themselves, the Nazis using local administrative structures to automate their own extermination. It was one of the cruelest ironies. Victims forced by their persecutors to pick the members of their own community for deportation. The paperwork was a knife disguised as bureaucracy. Maginek's workshops hummed with forced labor. Jewish prisoners were pressed into service building rail spurs, repairing rolling stock, and making crates for goods looted from other camps. Their hands, calloused and bloodied, produced the very infrastructure that would carry them to death. They learned the rhythms of the operation and the cadence of their tasks. Morning roll call, a day of labor, return to cramped barracks, the wait for orders. For some, that wait turned into transport orders. For others, it became the months of grinding survival that eventually destroyed them. The work turned victims into the architects of their own undoing, a detail the command twisted into efficient expediency. Lublin also housed training sites. Treblinka, a short distance away, became a grim schoolhouse where guards were trained and hardened. Recruits, often Soviet POWs or collaborators from occupied territories, were taught how to control crowds, how to shoot without hesitation, how to direct trains and manage prisoners. The instructors drilled them in administrative discipline as well as violence. The SS wanted guards who could obey orders and perform with mechanical regularity. Instructors taught not just technique, but apathy, the emotional numbness that made mass murder possible. Treblinka emerged as a grim export industry. Trained men would be sent to Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, and then on to other killing fields as the Reich extended its reach. Supply chains were managed with a mercantile efficiency that revealed the full extent of the bureaucratic mind behind a machine. Food shipments for guards, coal for cremation pits, diesel for engines used in gas operations, wire for fences, and glass for windows, all of it passed through Lublin's stores. The camp accountants tallied requisitions. They recorded gold recovered from victims, hair packed in burlap sacks, clothing sorted for shipment to the Reich. The stolen property of the murdered entered a transport corridor that made its way into German industry and the pockets of officers. Lublin's bookkeeping turned human tragedy into fiscal entries. The presence of Jewish forced laborers with technical skills also made Lublin's role more insidious. Tailors repaired uniforms. Watchmakers mended clocks. Carpenters built coffins for a system that would soon prefer cremation to burial. In the workshops, the sounds were a grotesque chorus: saws, needles, hammers. Each noise an ordinary sound overlaid with an extraordinary cruelty. Men who once held crafts now repaired the tools of their own destruction. It was an intimacy of violence that seared memory into the bones of survivors. Communication networks linked Lublin to Berlin and to the far-flung ghettos. Couriers traveled back and forth carrying orders, schedules, and occasional inspections. Radios hummed in secure rooms. Coded messages moved through channels that had been scrubbed of explicit language. When higher authorities wanted deniability, they used euphemism and compartmentalization. Details of slaughter were whispered in corridors and transmitted in abbreviations. The more effective the secrecy, the smoother the operation. Secrecy was its own oil. Resistance was possible, and it began in small, invisible ways. Some railway workers discreetly delayed carriages. An increasingly brave handful of clerks tampered with manifests, misfiled a name here, delayed a transfer there. Priests and local notables attempted to pass messages of warning to those about to be transported, though such acts were rare and perilous. Far more common was the private grief of those who watched. Mothers clutching infants tighter, men staring at departing trains until the last carbox Sten figure disappeared, neighbors who left a loaf of bread on a stoop for a family already targeted. These tiny acts never stopped the machine, but they were evidence that humanity lingered in the cracks. Within the offices of Globoknik, tension sometimes flared. He demanded speed. His officers argued for caution. He wanted to move entire towns at once, while railroad officials argued about timetables and rolling stock. The compromises became part of the method, the way to balance the wartime strain on infrastructure with the urgency of extermination. When trains broke down, the wheels of the operation slowed. It was an affront to Himmler's demand for efficiency, and punishments followed. Yet the system adapted, and adaptation became specialization. Teams developed to handle breakdowns, to manage crowd control, to speed up unloading. Lublin's staff prided themselves on troubleshooting. Their pride revealed the depth of their complicity. Photography and documentation in Lublin served both practical and propagandistic ends. SS photographers were instructed to take images that could be filed as proof of resettlement. Groups of people lining up, trains arriving, goods cataloged. These images were stripped of context and used in reports that sanitized reality. Still, some photographs leaked, smudged, hidden, later smuggled out by witnesses. Those images, when found after the war, became crucial fragments of testimony. The timbered fence, the watchtower shadow, the blank faces of the deported. They were small shards of truth in a landscape of deception. The human cost was wrenching. Families were torn apart at platforms. Children clung to their mothers. Old men counted their steps as they were herded with the mechanical indifference of livestock. The sound of a steam whistle became a summons to a fate no one could name in advance. Smells became a language. The sweet, metallic odor of preserved goods, the sour of overcrowded cars, the unmistakable burn of wood and later, of flesh. These sensory memories would remain with survivors like scars, returning without warning in the silent hours. And yet, in the midst of the command center's relentless efficiency, moments of moral despair surfaced among some who witnessed the work. A few clerks sobbed alone after work. A train conductor refused overtime. A guard wrote in a letter that he could not take part in this any longer, and then disappeared from records. But such acts were exceptions, anomalies swallowed by a system designed to minimize dissent. The machinery was indifferent to conscience. It loved uniformity. As the seasons turned, the network grew. Lublin's rail maps filled with more pins. Majdanek expanded its warehouses. Troniki's training rotations lengthened. New personnel arrived with crisp uniforms and blank expressions, taught to perform cruelty as if it were a drill. The more the operation matured, the quieter the town seemed, as if an invisible hand had muffled ordinary noise in the service of something monstrous. Orders from Berlin arrived with increasing frequency. Himmler's directives demanded results. The officers in Lublin replied with timetables and manifests, with requisitions and personnel lists. The conversation between command and execution took place in clipped minutes at the end of the day, in signatures scrawled over forms, in the indifferent clatter of office machinery. The human consequences remained unread and uncounted in those rooms, placed instead on the manifest, and moved along the rails. And still, As winter deepened and snow pressed underfoot, an unspoken unease trembled through the city. The smoke columns that rose in the distance no longer seemed random. The river carried rumors downstream. Some began to speak in hushed tones of an operation that could not remain hidden forever. Yet as more trains ran on schedule and the paperwork stacked higher, the men in Lublin doubled down on efficiency. Their faith that order could hide atrocity, their confidence that silence would outlast inquiry. What they did not know, even in the hub of their own creation, was how the world beyond would change. Reports of resistance in other regions filtered in like thin warnings. Partisan activity, Allied reconnaissance, the shifting front lines to the east. The command in Lublin considered contingency, not repentance. They planned for relocation, for concealment, for the extraction of records. They calculated how to erase footprints. They had become adepts at covering tracks. But covering tracks is a sign of fear. And fear, like smoke, rises visibly from the camp forests. The men in Lublin had built a system so intertwined with daily life that its unraveling would not be a single moment, but a tearing, slow, painful, and revealing. As the command center pulsed with its ordinary, terrible tasks, it also stood on the brink of exposure. The next moves would be decisive. The transfer of methods from prototype to scale, the escalation of slaughter at the satellite camps, and the first unexpected resistances that would ripple outward, testing the limits of a machine that believed itself infallible. Chapter 4. The Birth of Belzec. The first sound you would have heard at Belzec was timber striking timber, the crisp, ordered noise of construction, not the raw, chaotic shout you might expect at a battlefield. Men heaved planks, hammered nails, and raised fences with the indifferent rhythm of builders. The site sat in a hollow of scrub and pine, a place chosen for concealment, remote enough that smoke could be blamed on industry, close enough to a rail spur to make logistics practical. To the casual eye, it looked like a new work camp taking shape. To the men who designed it, it was something else entirely, an experiment in annihilation, a prototype for mass murder perfected into a machine. The decision to build Belzec was part technical, part political. After the bureaucrats in Berlin sketched the outlines of a final solution, the question became how to scale slaughter without burning out the people who carried it out. The T4 euthanasia program had taught the Nazis that killing by poison and gas could be done in secrecy and with administrative neatness. What they learned in hospitals and asylums, sealed rooms, deception, transportable engines, was now being translated to a far larger canvas. Belzec would be the crucible where those lessons met mass transport, where the theory of industrial murder would be tested against the reality of thousands arriving every week. From the moment the first foundations were poured, the designers thought in terms of flow. Arrival, undressing, deception, killing, disposal, a set of stages like stations on a factory floor. Engineers sketched unloading ramps that led directly into fenced reception areas. They drew shelters that resembled bathhouses. They designed false chimneys and fake delousing stations. Every element served to remove resistance, to keep panic at bay, to keep the human cargo moving. Where old death was chaotic and bloody, here the goal was silence and speed. The more the operation resembled ordinary life, benches, crates, queues, the less likely people were to resist. On site, the men who built Belzec were a strange mixture. Local labor pressed into service, German engineers, SS supervisors, and Jewish prisoners forced to perform the worst of the work. The prisoners, already stripped of their names, nailed boards, mixed concrete, and laid tracks under the watchful gaze of machine-like guards. Their hands learned the contours of the camp before their minds could accept what those forms would mean. The smell of fresh cut would mingled with a metallic tang of sweat and the ever-present, distant smoke from cook fires. Occasionally, a cart would arrive laden with bricks, sacks of lime, or the crude fittings that would soon make the gas chambers airtight. Every supply was a promise of function. Christian Worth moved through the site with a hawk's attention to detail. He had come from the T4 program and carried with him a cold pragmatism about killing that felt clinical to some, genius to others of his circle. He demanded airtight seals, efficient ventilation for workspaces, and doors that could not be forced from within. He argued over the best diesel placement and insisted on procedures for moving bodies. He wanted structures that not only killed, but did so in a way that left minimal visible evidence. He wanted the noise hidden, the result invisible. For him, the moral dimension was irrelevant. The task was to ensure that the machine worked. The early tests were brutal in their banality. Diesel engines that would eventually be used to channel exhaust into sealed rooms were trialed in small sheds behind the camp perimeter. Technicians adjusted pipe diameters and monitored how quickly a sealed room filled with lethal fumes. They timed the processes, took notes, and adjusted. Where once executioners used guns and had to account for recoil and emotion, these engineers measured minutes and volume. That technical vocabulary, liters, inches, minutes, became the language of murder. The men scribbled figures in soot-smudged notebooks, as though writing recipes for an industry. The deception of victims was as carefully engineered as the gas flow. Trains arrived at makeshift platforms, and men with insignia and calm voices directed the guests as if directing holiday travelers to baths and delousing. Women were told to remove shoes for inspection. Children were reassured with toys taken from their bags. The reception areas were decorated with signs and schedules, grotesquely municipal in their normalcy. Some victims paused, bewildered by the civilized ordinariness. Others clung to hope, to the idea that a uniform meant work, not death. That hope was part of the lethality of the design. It kept people docile long enough to be processed. Inside the fence compound, small details mattered. Benches were placed in a circle to maintain order. Clothes were folded in neat stacks and labeled, then loaded onto carts for shipment. Personal possessions were inventoried and set aside. The sound of laughter, the unnatural, brittle kind of those trying to hold themselves together, echoed in the reception area and was taken as proof the deception worked. Guards in field gray patrolled with an everyday nonchalance that some villagers later said looked almost bored. The ordinariness of their behavior made the extraordinary horror more credible. The first gassing operations were carried out with terrifying efficiency. Men and women who had been told to undress and wait for disinfection were herded into sealed rooms. The diesel engines roared. Pipes rattled. Within minutes the air filled with a hot, oily smell that many later survivors would recall as the scent that preceded the end. Some coughed, some fainted, all soon fell silent. To the technicians, those minutes were data. To the families, they were entire dissolving worlds. Disposal of the dead was another technical problem, and one the camps solved with grim practicality. At first, mass graves were dug. Bodies were stacked like cordwood, doused, and buried. But decomposition and smell presented complications, and the need for speed increased as more transports arrived. Cremation pits and open-air pyres became the method of choice. Bodies burned in tall, hungry flames, and the smoke rose in a steady column, black against sky, visible for miles on the right kind of day. Locals would later point to that plume as the first visible evidence that something outside cooking fires was happening deep in the forest. The camp's administrators kept meticulous records, not of names to be preserved, but of numbers to be accounted. How many had arrived? How many were processed? How many kilos of gold had been seized? How many sacks of hair cataloged for transport? The theft of property became bureaucratic routine. Dressmakers, clerks, and accountants, some German, some local collaborators, recorded the spoils in ledgers, conferred about the best way to funnel items into the economy, and smiled when requisition orders were fulfilled. The removal of humanity from the dead was literal. The survivors of such theft later describe how their own relatives' wedding rings appeared in market stalls in distant towns. Resistance at Belzec was rare, but not absent. A small number of prisoners attempted to sabotage engines, foul pipes, or smuggle messages outside. One story tells of a man who loosened a bolt and caused a temporary halt. Another recounts a seamstress who had a note sewn into a garment. These acts were brave and costly. Many of them ended in brutal reprisals, beatings in the yard, summary executions, and reinforcements of security measures. Yet even the attempt to resist punctured the administration's illusion of total control. For a moment, the machine stuttered, proving it was not invincible. Outside the fences, villagers lived with a mixture of denial and knowledge. They noted strange arrival times, saw cargo cars wrapped in tarpaulins, and sometimes overheard shouting before trains moved away again. People spoke in whispers, traded rumors, and avoided the area when smoke rose thickly. The SS used terror, payments, and occasional placations to discourage curiosity. They also cultivated a narrative of necessity, that these were security measures, that resettlement was for the greater good. Many complied because fear and survival instincts were stronger than moral clarity in the winter of occupation. Belzec's role in Operation Reinhard was not static. As engineering and procedural tweaks improved throughput, its function evolved. Initially a prototype, it became a template for other camps. Techniques tested successfully at Belzec were documented and transmitted to Sobibor and Treblinka. Commanders visited and took notes. Blueprints and standard operating procedures were copied into files and filed away in Lublin, where Globoknik staff treated them like construction manuals. This bureaucratic exchange of methods transformed localized brutality into a replicable system. The human cost, the scale of disappearance, began to register only gradually in the records and in the silence of affected communities. Entire families vanished between census dates. Shops closed with no explanation. Synagogues stood silent. The geography of life changed in maps. Pins that once signaled communities faded into blank spaces. Those left behind felt an emptiness that was less theatrical than it was a slow, numbing erosion. The absence became the testimony of what had happened, and the absence was loud. Belzec also taught the perpetrators about psychological maintenance. They learned how to rotate staff to minimize breakdowns among guards, how to stage normal workdays to keep routine from cracking, and how to compartmentalize tasks so individuals could claim ignorance about the whole. Men who worked the ovens might not speak to the men who arranged trains. The men who cataloged clothing might not be told the final destination of the hair sacks. Compartmentalization insulated consciences and made the system more resilient. It turned atrocity into a series of plausible denials. But the more efficient the camp became, the more it exposed itself to the world. Reports of missing trains and the sight of smoke could not be fully contained. Word traveled through networks of trade and family. Refugees carried fragments of truth to other towns. An itinerant peddler might tell a neighbor of a smell that would not leave his clothes. The Allies' intelligence gradually pieced together hints. The camp's very throughput, the speed with which it processed human beings, left traces. Destruction at scale, by its nature, creates evidence. Emptied towns, disrupted supply chains, overburdened rail logs. Yet Belzec's managers continued to optimize. They experimented with new ways to reduce noise, moving cremations to windy afternoons, using covered pits, timing arrivals by weather forecasts when possible. They attempted to cloak their operations in the ordinary. Still, as months passed, the toll in bodies and in memories mounted. Survivors who would later speak of Belzec did so with fractured recollections. The whistle of a locomotive, a child's lullaby swallowed by a guard's bark, the oily taste in the mouth that preceded collapse. Those sensory fragments composed the archive of trauma that statistics could never convey. Then, as ever in the war, larger tides began to press on the camp. Military developments on the Eastern Front shifted priorities and threatened supply routes. The same rail lines that had been so useful now faced disruption. Himmler's paranoia about exposure grew. Globoknik began to plan for contingencies. Methods to conceal graves, plans to destroy records, and discussions about exhumation and burning should the front move too close. That conversation, the decision to hide evidence of mass murder, would set in motion another phase of horror. What had been industrial murder would now be followed by frantic attempts to erase it. Belzec would not remain isolated for long. The methods and lessons learned there would be passed on, adapted, and at times amplified. The camp's blueprints would become a dark text read by men keen to replicate genocide elsewhere. Yet even as the architects exported their techniques, they could not fully anticipate the consequences of spreading mechanical death like contagion. The moral corrosion of every institution that helped, the ripple effects of terror in communities, and the eventual weight of undeniable proof that would one day be pulled up from the ground. The camp's early months were thus paradoxical, methodical in assembly, improvisational in the face of unforeseen problems, and increasingly confident in the belief that secrecy could outlast suspicion. But secrecy is a brittle thing. Smoke, smell, and rumor do not obey office schedules. They seep into consciousness, and as the engineers at Belzec perfected their procedures, a broader network watched closely, copying, learning, iterating. Belzec was the first polished tool in the Reinhard kit, efficient, hideous, and dangerously instructive. By the time the camp had reached its grim rhythm, the forest around it no longer belonged to nature alone. It carried the imprint of human contrivance, paths worn by carts, the scar of building foundations, and the ring of clearing where wood had been piled for burning. The trees bore witness. Their needles collected ash. Their trunks kept the echoes of the hammers. In that silence, the machinery of annihilation had found a home. The next stage would be expansion, new camps taking the lessons of Belzec and pushing them further. And within that expansion, new methods, new cruelties, and the first desperate acts of organized prisoner resistance would change the shape of the operation in ways no planner could fully control. Chapter 5, Sobibor, the system perfected. The arrival was always a small theater of normalcy. An engine's whistle, the clack of wheels on rails, the shouted names of conductors, and then a procession that moved with a cruel choreography. At Sobibor, that choreography was refined until it looked effortless. Men in uniforms spoke in calm voices. Signs pointed to baths and delousing. Benches waited. Children clutched toys. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and soap. For a brief, terrible moment, the scene held the absurd promise of everyday life. It was the promise that kept people from fighting back until it was too late. This, more than anything, was the camp's triumph, the conversion of terror into routine. Sobibor began not as a single monstrous idea, but as a series of small decisions. Choices about layout, about deception, about how to move a human tide without resistance. The camp planners learned from Belzec and from the euthanasia operations at T4. They saw what worked and what had not. At Sobibor they adopted a new vocabulary: reception, undressing, procession, gassing, disposal. They designed the space so that each action flowed into the next, like conveyor belts in a factory. The trick was psychological as much as architectural. The calmer the transfer, the more the victims cooperated. Panic was the enemy of efficiency. When trains pulled in, officers and Ukrainian auxiliaries coordinated the flow with the precision of a drill. Men were separated from women. Those who could walk were told to leave their luggage for processing. The camp's reception area was staged to look like an administration. Signs, benches, even posters. In many cases, victims had no reason to distrust the charade at first. They had been told the same lies all along: work in the East, resettlement, a new life. The uniforms and the politely delivered orders gave those lies the weight of officialness. That weight broke resistance before it could form. Inside the fences, guards engineered sight lines deliberately. The camp's designers placed fences, hedges, and buildings so that those waiting could not see the deeper structures where gas chambers operated. The reception area faced away from the disposal pits. The path to the baths rounded a corner and swallowed sight. Even the sound of engines and the smell of burning were masked by distance and wind. These were small, cunning tricks, what one officer later called perspective management. By shaping what victims saw and what they could not see, The camp turned visibility into weaponry. The gas chambers themselves were a study in brutal practicality. They were not ornate. They were functional, built to look like shower rooms, fitted with false nozzles and benches. They were sealed with heavy doors and connected to diesel engines. The sound before death, the cough, a muffled cry, then an oily hum, was mechanical, like a machine spinning up to full speed. Technicians timed each cycle, calibrated air pressure, measured how long it took for a sealed room to go still. For the men running the operation, those minutes were data points. For those inside, they were entire lives collapsing in on themselves. Sobibor staff tested every element. They timed how quickly a crowd could be moved from the platform into the compound, how many could be crowded into a chamber without causing structural problems, how best to sort clothing so it could be quickly cataloged. They watched how people moved when they believed they were being led to showers and adjusted routes accordingly. Trees were felled and replanted to create shadowy corridors. Paths were paved to prevent mud and delay. The landscape itself became instrumented to death. The camp's leadership cultivated a particular demeanor among personnel: impassive, efficient, unflappable. Men who laughed at mess halls and joked on guard rotations were the same men who supervised the most intimate aspects of killing. That casualness was intentional. It was part of the technique the SS taught, a kind of emotional insulation. They rotated staff to prevent breakdowns. They issued bonuses and privileges to those who performed well. The more normal the behavior looked, the less room there was for outside suspicion. Inside, the veneer of office routine obfuscated the size of the crime. Prisoner labor was also critical to the camp's function. A small group of prisoners, Sonderkommandos, were forced to do the dirty work: remove clothes, sort valuables, load bodies onto carts. They were trained by example to perform quickly and without hesitation. The SS kept these units isolated and under constant threat. A Sonderkommando might live for weeks, rarely months. The men who worked there learned, with a cold clarity, the mechanics of the killing machine. Their knowledge made them both indispensable and doomed. They carried the memory of the most immediate horror. Their hands remembered what the mind tried to forget. Sobibor's economy of murder included theft as a formal process. Valuables removed from the dead, jewelry, watches, and coins, were inventoried and transported towards central depots. Hair was shorn, pressed into sacks, and counted as raw material. Boots and clothing were repaired or repurposed in workrooms. The camp's accounts balanced like ledgers in any commercial enterprise: inputs, outputs, losses, requisitions. The monetary language of requisition orders and expenditure notes made the grotesque business appear routine and justified. The abstraction of numbers did what uniforms and paperwork had done before. It removed faces from the calculus. In the surrounding countryside, the sight and smell of the camp still leaked out. Villagers reported seeing smoke on certain days and hearing the distant hum of engines. Children were warned to stay away. Local shopkeepers spoke of travelers who never returned. Yet silence remained the dominant currency. That silence was bought with fear. Disappearances were met with swift reprisals, and any inquiry could result in beatings or imprisonment. People adapted their lives to a new normal. Bookshops closed early. Market gossip fell into hushed tones, and priests avoided sermons that might be construed as criticizing the authorities. Survival required discretion. The camp's administrators also learned to manipulate time. They scheduled transports for early morning, when fog and darkness aided concealment. They timed cremations and bonfires to coincide with weather that would carry smoke away or camouflage odor. They maintained a rhythm: arrivals, processing, killing, removal, a rhythm that masked the moral disorder behind a temporal structure. That rhythm, repeated day after day, normalized horror. Routine, repetition, and scheduling became instruments of depersonalization. Sobibor's reputation among SS circles was mixed with pride. Some boasted of the cleanliness of the operation. Others envied the apparent speed of processing. Officers compared methods, and swapped notes about how to minimize panic or confuse witnesses. Conferences and visits reinforced a culture of emulation. What worked at Sobibor would be tried elsewhere. This network of imitation carried techniques across camps, accelerating the spread of method and making the machinery of death more uniform across the Reinhard system. But the machine was never wholly closed. Small miscalculations, human error, and the unpredictable behavior of crowds created moments of disruption. Guards misread orders. Diesel engines conked out. A cart lost a wheel. A rainstorm turned a yard into a quagmire. Someone cried out too loudly. Each of these moments forced improvisation. Officers had to make choices under pressure. Those choices revealed the system's seams. They also provided tiny openings that sometimes allowed fragments of survival. Someone hidden in a cargo pile, a forged document, a misname in a manifest. Alongside technical problem-solving, there was also psychological warfare. The SS used stage elections in ghettos, tricking communal leaders into cooperating, and they used rumor as a weapon. Whispers of work, of relocation, of leniency. They fed false hope with administrative gestures, allowing a few parcels through, delaying a transport by a day, permitting a letter. All of these gestures were calculated to elicit cooperation. The cruelty was often subtle. A promise withheld, a day of rest revoked, a small kindness used to keep people pliable. And yet, despite the scales of the system, the human moments that punctured it were searing. Mothers sang quietly to their children as they were herded. Old men, bewildered, clung to memories of market days long before occupation. A merchant folded his ledger as if he might return to it. Such acts of ordinary life were small rebellions against the machinery designed to erase them. The persistence of memory in the smallest things, an old scarf, a lullaby, a recipe, became a form of resistance. The SS fought to strip those memories away, but they could not completely succeed. Sobibor's structure also created new moral complexities among its perpetrators. Some guards developed perverse routines, little rituals that eased their conscience. Others drank heavily to blunt what they could not otherwise bear. There were exchanges in the mess halls, jokes that sounded like laughter but were a kind of camouflage for guilt. Competitions arose over who processed more transports. Commendations were given for keeping schedules. In this way, the camp institutionalized cruelty as professional merit. The more efficient you were, the more rewarded. Prisoner solidarity, however fragile, began to form in the margins. Men and women shared scraps of food, whispered advice on how to keep a child quiet in the quiver of an allotted minute, or offered each other small lies to keep fear at bay. These gestures were the seedlings of organized resistance. In the shadows of the camp, furtive conversations hatched plans, and what began as whispered consolation would one day become a coordinated attempt at escape. Even in the midst of the most perfect system of killing, some prisoners refused the logic of extinction. That refusal shaped the moral geography of Sobibor. It created a ripple that the SS could not entirely smother. Secret signals passed through the camp, a folded strip of cloth here, a knocked rhythm on a crate there. Small acts accumulated into networks of trust. The Sonderkommandos, despite their precarious position, shared knowledge that would be vital in a future uprising. Craftsmen used their trades, tailors, carpenters, shoemakers, to subvert the system in quiet ways, carving out little havens of humanity where they could. As the months wore on, Sobibor's methods were refined and its throughput increased. The camp became a darker mirror. What began as deception had become ritual. Men who once hesitated now moved with the ease of habit. Schedules filled like calendars. Trains arrived, were emptied, and departed with surprising speed. The efficiency became a source of perverse pride among those running the operation. It became a headline in internal reports. Yet the more perfect the system grew, the more brittle it became. Perfection breeds overconfidence, and overconfidence breeds error. Reports began to arrive that the front was shifting, that Allied air raids would come, that partisan activity in the forest was increasing. Men at Sobibor adjusted. Guards removed. Security tightened. Commands whispered about secrecy. Orders demanded caution. The camp that had mastered the choreography of death now had to worry about disruption from outside. That anxiety altered behavior inside. Rotations lengthened, inspections intensified, and paranoia spread. The very measures that had hidden the camp's crimes now made it cagey and reactive. In that charged atmosphere, the smallest misstep could cascade. A misfiled document, a complacent guard, a wagon left unlatched. Any of these could be a spark. And sparks, in a machine as dry and tightly wound as Sobibor, can flare into something the planners never intended. In the deepest nights, when the cremations had cooled and the yard lay under a gray hush, prisoners muttered of escape. They spoke in numbers and in timetables. They counted guards, noted weapon stores, whispered which gates were weaker. The idea of flight, once absurd, metastasized into a dangerous possibility. The camp had perfected a system, but perfection does not mean invulnerability. In the quiet that followed each day's work, the camp's invisible scenes showed themselves. Whispered plans, forged tools, small acts of sabotage. These were the slow undermining of the machine. And in the offices that recorded throughput with a cold hand, no one had yet imagined how a handful of desperate people could crack the choreography they had so carefully designed. Beyond Sobibor's fences, elsewhere in the Reinhard network, engineers and commanders watched and learned. Techniques from this camp would be copied and altered. Confidence in the system would spread. But within the camp, in the shadowed corners where men and women traded glances and soft-spoken commitments, a more dangerous lesson was forming. That the system's strength lay in its assumed completeness. And if that assumption could be broken, even for a moment, the entire choreography might unravel. The thought was both reckless and irresistible. Chapter 6, Treblinka, the engine of annihilation. The train slowed before dawn, its wheels screeching against frozen metal as it curved toward a small, unmarked station. From the carriages came the sounds of movement, groans, whispers, the shuffling of feet against wood. Through narrow slits in the planks, pale faces peered into mist. Somewhere ahead, beyond the tree line, smoke drifted upward. It was not the first train to arrive here, nor would it be the last. In the months that followed, Treblinka would become a graveyard without tombstones, a place where entire worlds were erased in a single morning. It was not chaos, it was routine, and that was its most terrifying achievement. Treblinka was born out of numbers, cold, unyielding calculations from the SS headquarters in Lublin. The camps at Belzec and Sobibor had proven that mass murder could be systematized, but they could not handle the flood of deportations from the Warsaw Ghetto, the largest Jewish community in Europe. A new site was needed, one closer to the capital, one capable of handling thousands of arrivals every day. The planners called it Treblinka II. The locals simply called it the Forest. No sign, no marker, no entry in official timetables would betray its true purpose. It was to be the centerpiece of Operation Reinhard, the engine that would consume nearly 1 million lives in a single year. The location was chosen with mathematical precision. It lay along a railway branch line that curved gently from Alkinia, hidden by trees and distant from major roads. Engineers from the SS construction office arrived in early June 1942, accompanied by Ukrainian auxiliaries and German overseers. Within weeks, fences of barbed wire and pine logs rose from the earth. Watchtowers appeared. The camp was small, no larger than a few football fields, but its design was deceptive. From the air, it looked like a simple labor facility. Inside, it was a trap so well conceived that few ever understood what it was until the doors closed behind them. Christian Worth, now the inspector of Operation Reinhard camps, oversaw its creation. He brought with him lessons from Belzec and Sobibor: better flow, improved concealment, faster turnover. Treblinka's layout was drawn like a funnel, from the train platform to the undressing yard, from the undressing yard through the tube, a fenced path that led straight to the gas chambers. There were no corners, no dead ends, no pauses. The design ensured one direction only, forward. Everything, even the trees, was part of the deception. Franz Stangl was appointed commandant, a tall Austrian with the demeanor of a bureaucrat. He was not a man of open rage. He spoke softly, smiled easily, and described himself as an administrator. He did not see himself as a killer, but as a manager of logistics, a man ensuring that trains arrived and departed on time. His subordinates, such as Kurt Franz and Irmfried Eberl, operated under similar delusions of professionalism. Eberl, the camp's first commandant, was less disciplined. His brutality and mismanagement left corpses piling along the tracks in those first chaotic weeks. Himmler himself visited to inspect the disaster. What he saw enraged him. The operation needed not frenzy, but order. Eberl was removed. Stangl took over and imposed efficiency. Under his command, death became punctual. The scale of Treblinka dwarfed anything before it. Each train carried between 40 and 60 cars, each packed with 200 people. The passengers had been told they were going to the east for resettlement or labor. Instead, the train halted at a platform adorned with flowers and a painted sign that read, Treblinka Station. SS officers in polished boots called out instructions. Ukrainian guards with rifles herded people in lines. Barked orders filled the cold air. Leave your luggage. Keep valuables for identification. For those stepping onto the platform, exhaustion blurred with relief. They had arrived. The nightmare of transport was over. They believed they would be deloused, registered, given food. The truth was unthinkable. The illusion was total. Men and women were separated under the pretense of hygiene. Those deemed fit for work were led toward the undressing yard, a space walled with branches to block sight lines. Children clung to mothers, confused by the commotion. Loudspeakers played music to mask the sounds from deeper inside the camp. Prisoners, forced to serve as the reception crew, moved among the new arrivals, speaking softly, urging calm. They did so not out of cruelty, but out of terror. Their survival depended on it. Some whispered warnings, but few believed them. Who could imagine that beyond the gate-marked showers, no one lived for more than 15 minutes? Inside the gas chambers, diesel engines roared. Pipes vibrated. Within minutes, the voices from inside turned into a single, collective pounding on the doors. Then came silence. Guards smoked cigarettes. Others joked. When the engines stopped, the doors swung open, and the bodies fell forward in heaps. Prisoners of the Sonderkommando, men selected to handle the corpses, rushed in, dragging bodies to pits or to the cremation grids. They worked in feverish rhythm, their minds numbed by repetition. They had no time to think, only to obey. After each batch, the floor was hosed down, the chambers swept, and the next train was already waiting. In the early days, bodies were buried in mass graves, but the scale of death overwhelmed the ground itself. The stench was unbearable, and the earth began to swell and split. Flies thickened in the air, coating the faces of guards and workers alike. Himmler ordered change. The bodies would be exhumed and burned. Iron grates, made from railway rails, were erected over pits. Corpses were stacked in layers, wood, body, and doused with gasoline. The fires burned day and night, visible for villages miles away. Smoke clung to clothing, hair, and skin. Even the trees nearby seemed to absorb the smell. Witnesses later said that the air around Treblinka never again felt clean. The camp's efficiency was staggering. In less than 15 months, it murdered more than 800,000 people, mostly Jews from Poland, Austria, Greece, France, and Czechoslovakia. Each operation was timed, recorded, and analyzed. Stangl boasted that Treblinka could process up to 12,000 people per day. Reports to Lublin praised the smooth functioning of the facility. Within the SS, Treblinka became the model, a symbol of administrative excellence. Globoknik sent photographs to Berlin showing neat rows of barracks and fences, carefully avoiding any image of the killing areas. On paper, Treblinka was a triumph of organization. In reality, it was hell disguised as order. Among the prisoners forced to live within the camp, survival meant submission and silence. They slept in barracks near the killing zone, under constant watch. They worked sorting clothes, extracting gold teeth, cutting hair, or loading bodies onto pyres. They knew the truth no one outside could believe. Some tried to hold on to fragments of humanity, a prayer muttered under breath, a stolen piece of bread shared at night, a glance toward the sky when no one was watching. They marked days by the rhythm of trains. Each whistle meant more lives gone, more work to do. But not all accepted silence forever. Beneath the crushing despair, a spark of rebellion began to form. Prisoners whispered about stolen weapons, about escape. They studied guard routines, memorized shift changes, noted the location of keys and armories. It was madness to hope. Every attempt would mean instant death, but hope was the last thing they had to lose. Slowly, secret groups formed, bound by desperation. The uprising that would come months later began here, in hushed exchanges beside the cremation pits, in the eyes of men who refused to die without fighting back. Outside Treblinka, the world carried on its sleep. German railway officials processed invoices. Civil servants in Warsaw filed transport requests. Shopkeepers sold clothing looted from the dead, unaware, or pretending not to know, where it came from. The wealth extracted from Treblinka poured back into the Reich's economy. Gold melted into bars, watches distributed to soldiers, jewelry sent to Himmler's offices. The connection between bureaucracy and murder became seamless. Death had been transformed into paperwork. Even within the SS hierarchy, there were those who grew uneasy. Some complained about the stench, the endless trains, the nightmares. Others wrote to superiors requesting transfer. Himmler ignored them. "History will thank us," he said. The words became mantra. They convinced themselves they were building a better world through destruction. That delusion insulated them against guilt. They were not killing individuals. They told themselves they were solving a problem. By the spring of 1943, the scale of the operation had reached its peak. Ghettos across Poland were liquidated. Entire cities vanished from maps. The Warsaw Ghetto uprising that April sent shockwaves through the Nazi command, but it did not halt the killing. If anything, it accelerated it. Trains that once carried the living now carried the remnants of rebellion. Those captured after the uprising were sent to Treblinka as punishment. Few survived more than a day. As the months passed, rumors began to seep even into the ranks of the guards. The war in the East was turning. The Red Army was advancing. Some wondered what would happen when the front lines reached them. Others laughed it off, convinced of eternal victory. But beneath the bravado was unease. Globoknik and Worth visited more frequently, issuing new orders. Records were to be destroyed, graves emptied, bodies burned. The goal was not just to kill, but to erase the evidence that killing had ever happened. Sonderkommandos were forced to dig up corpses that had lain for months, the flesh turning to wax, the smell unbearable. They burned them on pyres until nothing was left but ash. The ash was crushed, sifted, and scattered over fields. It was as if the Nazis believed they could burn memory itself. But memory is stubborn. It hides in survivors, in fragments, in the eyes of witnesses. Among the prisoners at Treblinka, the preparations for erasure only deepened their resolve to escape. They knew they would soon be killed. Their only chance was rebellion. In secret, they smuggled weapons, bribed guards with gold and vodka, and prepared for the moment when the camp's own system of order could be turned against itself. That uprising would come later, a desperate act of defiance that would shatter the illusion of invincibility the Nazis had built. For now, the trains kept coming. Each whistle was a sentence passed in absentia. Each arrival followed the same script. A calm voice, a lie, a line of people moving toward death. The efficiency never faltered. Treblinka had become the engine of annihilation, the ultimate expression of industrialized evil. It was the moment when the Nazi obsession with order reached its logical end. Extermination rendered as process, genocide disguised as administration. In the final months of its operation, as the fires burned higher and the ash thickened in the air, the men who had built Treblinka began to destroy it. Barracks were dismantled, fences torn down, the ground plowed over. Trees were planted to hide the scars. A farmhouse was built atop the site, complete with livestock, to make it look like nothing had ever existed there. It was a lie built on the ruins of truth. But the earth remembered. Beneath the thin layer of grass and straw lay the compacted remains of hundreds of thousands of lives. Treblinka was not merely a place. It was a system, an idea made real through calculation and obedience. It was what happens when human beings turn their intelligence toward annihilation instead of creation. The men who ran it believed they had built something efficient, something necessary, something that would vanish without a trace. But the smoke they released carried further than they ever imagined. It drifted over the forests and fields, over towns and rivers, and settled into history itself. And in that history, Treblinka would remain, not as an industrial success, not as an example of efficiency, but as the purest demonstration of how order can become evil, and how civilization, when stripped of conscience, can organize the destruction of its own soul. The engine they built would stop only when the fire consumed itself. But by then, the world had already been changed forever. Chapter 7. The Machinery of Death. It began with the whistle of a train, sharp, metallic, echoing through pine forests that had forgotten what silence meant. Every arrival was the same. A screech of brakes, a burst of steam, then the heavy thud of doors sliding open. To anyone who stepped out of those cars, the air felt wrong. Too still, too clean, like the pause before a storm. Guards barked orders. Dogs strained on leashes. Somewhere nearby, engines hummed. It was all so ordinary on the surface. Yet every detail had been engineered to deceive, to move thousands toward death with the precision of an assembly line. The machinery of Operation Reinhard was not made of metal alone. It was built of lies, fear, and obedience. From the moment a transport left a ghetto, the system began to work. Paperwork flowed first. Orders, manifests, coded telegrams marked urgent. Railway clerks stamped tickets for journeys that had no return, recording the number of passengers in columns, never noting their names. The trains left Warsaw, Krakow, Lublin, and Radom, usually before dawn. Families crowded into wooden freight cars. No windows, one bucket, barely enough air. Each car held up to 200 people. The doors slammed shut and were sealed from the outside. As the locomotive pulled away, its iron wheels screamed, carrying with them the illusion of movement toward life. But every mile forward brought them closer to an engineered abyss. Inside those trains, time became elastic. People fainted, prayed, argued, or went silent. The smell of sweat, urine, and terror grew unbearable. Infants cried until their voices cracked. The journey could last hours or days, depending on the tracks and the priority given by the Reichsbahn. To the railway workers, it was another transport order. To the SS, it was a triumph of coordination. To those inside, it was the beginning of the end. When the train finally slowed, hope flickered for a moment. Maybe this was a labor camp. Maybe they'd see sunlight again. Then the doors opened, and the barking began. At the platform, the choreography took over. Men in SS uniforms or black armbands stood with clipboards. Ukrainian guards shouted in rough Polish and Russian. Prisoners from the Sonderkommando, those who had been kept alive to work, moved among the arrivals, telling them to leave belongings, to form lines, to move quickly. They used soft voices because they knew what came next. They had lived it already. The deception was deliberate. Calm victims required fewer bullets. The machinery depended on speed. From the moment the train doors opened to the moment the last body fell silent inside a gas chamber, the entire process took less than 2 hours. It began with separation, men from women, children from parents. The old were told they would ride in trucks to a nearby infirmary. The sick were carried away, often shot on the edge of pits behind the reception area. The rest were led toward the undressing yard. Every camp had one, surrounded by high fences woven with pine branches. Signs in German instructed, "Remember your place. Keep your shoes together." Benches and hooks were numbered. There were even painted arrows pointing toward baths and showers. The illusion of order was perfect. As victims undressed, SS men and Ukrainian guards collected their valuables. Watches, gold rings, and money were tossed into baskets. Women were forced to cut their hair, one last act of humiliation disguised as hygiene. That hair would later be stuffed into sacks and shipped to factories in the Reich, used for insulation and cloth. The theft of humanity was complete before the killing even began. Once naked, the victims were herded into a narrow fenced path called the tube. It twisted through the camp like a snake, designed so that no one could see where it led. At the end stood a brick building with wooden doors. Above one, a sign read showers. The gas chambers varied between camps, but their purpose was the same. At Belzec, diesel engines were used. At Treblinka and Sobibor, they experimented with larger chambers, increasing capacity with every modification. The victims entered tightly packed, shoulder to shoulder, breathing shallowly in the dark. Guards slammed the doors shut, locking heavy metal bolts. Outside, the engine roared to life. The first few seconds were filled with confusion, then panic. Fists pounded on the doors. Mothers screamed for their children. Then came silence, broken only by the throbbing of the machine. The process took about 20 minutes. By the time the doors opened, the air inside was thick and wet. Bodies fell forward, tangled together, blue-faced and stiff. The corpses were dragged out by the Sonderkommando, who worked under constant threat of death. Their hands blistered from pulling bodies, from scrubbing blood and excrement off the floor. They were forced to pry gold teeth from mouths, cut off hair, search for hidden jewels. Every action had been reduced to a task. The SS watched, timing them, shouting when they slowed. The bodies were thrown into pits at first, layered with lime and dirt. But soon the stench spread. The ground swelled, shifting under pressure. Ravens circled in the sky. When Himmler visited in person and saw the sight, he ordered a new solution: cremation. Cremation became a new branch of the machinery. Railway rails were welded into grates, laid over deep pits. Logs and gasoline were added. The corpses were stacked in alternating layers, wood body like cordwood. When lit, the flames consumed them, crackling with a sound that haunted everyone who heard it. The smell carried for miles, a thick mixture of burning flesh, oil, and smoke. It clung to uniforms, hair, and food. The SS tried to mask it with perfume, with alcohol, with denial. But it was always there, drifting over fields and villages. Even the soil beneath the camps turned gray and greasy. Nature itself became a witness. The operation required constant maintenance. Trains had to arrive on schedule. Engines had to function. Guards had to remain alert. Bureaucrats in Lublin and Berlin exchanged reports written in code. Special treatment meant gassing. Resettlement meant extermination. Throughput meant the number of dead per day. Odilo Globoknik, the overseer of Operation Reinhard, demanded weekly totals. Christian Worth toured the camps, enforcing discipline, inspecting chambers, adjusting procedures. He was known as shoot a man for inefficiency. To them, it was not murder, it was management. They saw themselves as engineers of a better world, cleaning it of what they called impurity. That delusion turned genocide into paperwork. Even the bodies were counted and sorted. Each trainload had an estimate. The SS calculated how much gold they could extract, how many clothes they could ship, how much fat the cremation pits produced. The statistics gave the horror an illusion of logic. Every object had value except the lives destroyed. Piles of glasses, shoes, and children's toys filled warehouses, stacked floor to ceiling. The items were cleaned, labeled, and sent back to Germany. Some soldiers sent souvenirs home: rings, necklaces, watches, gifts for wives and lovers. They wrote letters bragging of their special duties, never explaining what those duties entailed. The machinery extended beyond the fences. Entire departments of the Reich relied on its output. Tailors repaired uniforms from stolen cloth. Armories used human hair to stuff cushions. Factories melted gold into bars stamped with eagles and swastikas. The wealth of the murdered flowed through the veins of the empire, financing the very war that made their deaths possible. Every cog in the Nazi machine, from the engineer to the accountant, was part of the killing process. They did not see it as murder. They saw it as production. But even machines strain under their own weight. By late 1942, the scale of killing had grown so vast that it began to consume its creators. Guards broke down. Some drank heavily, unable to sleep. Others turned sadistic, using violence to drown guilt. The SS issued lectures on duty and hardness, reminding men that compassion was weakness. Himmler himself gave speeches praising them for performing the hardest task ever faced by a nation. He called it an honorable burden. Those words allowed them to keep killing. The language of duty masked the reality of atrocity. Amid this relentless machinery, the few prisoners kept alive to serve began to lose all sense of time. Days blurred into nights. Seasons passed unnoticed. They worked, they watched, and they waited for death. Some were forced to dig graves for those they had known. Others recognized relatives among the corpses. Every day, their hands moved mechanically, their hearts shrinking into numbness. But even in that pit of despair, flickers of humanity endured. A whispered prayer, a piece of bread shared under threat of execution, a glance toward the sky when the guards weren't looking. These tiny acts defied the machine. The machinery of death was not only physical, it was psychological. The SS understood the need to break victims before killing them. That's why they used deception, why they maintained order and calm. A person who still hoped could be managed. A person who despaired might resist. They designed a process not to provoke emotion, but to suppress it. Even the gas itself was chosen because it left fewer marks, made less noise, produced less mess. Murder had become a science of tidiness. What made Operation Reinhard unique was its integration. Every camp was a node in a single network. Trains moved between them. Guards rotated. Officers shared techniques. When a new method improved efficiency in one place, it was replicated elsewhere. Death was standardized. By early 1943, the system ran with terrifying smoothness. Camps communicated with each other as if they were departments of the same factory. Himmler demanded data. Globoknik delivered. The network functioned like a well-oiled machine, until cracks began to form. The cracks came not from outside, but from within. The prisoners began to whisper of rebellion. Guards grew complacent. Engines failed. And war, which had once seemed distant, crept closer. The Red Army's push westward forced the Nazis to confront a possibility they had never planned for: defeat. What would happen to the machinery when the operators had to flee? The same efficiency that had made the system unstoppable now made it fragile. It could not exist without secrecy, without control. If exposed, it would collapse. Yet for the moment, the killing continued. Each day began with the same routine: roll call, orders, engines warming up. Each night ended with silence, interrupted only by the crackle of fires. The ground trembled as the pits burned, sending sparks into the dark. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of ash. Wolves prowled near the fences, drawn by the scent. Inside, the guards played cards, drank, and laughed, their faces glowing orange in the firelight. It was a world turned inside out. Death as labor, murder as duty, laughter as camouflage. The machinery of death was the triumph of the system over the soul. It required no hatred, only obedience. It thrived on apathy, not rage. Most of those who worked within it never raised their voices, never questioned orders. They simply followed procedure. That was its secret power, its ability to turn ordinary men into instruments of annihilation. When the camps finally fell and their ruins were uncovered, investigators found no grand machines, no advanced technology, only rail tracks, engines, paperwork, and graves. The genius of evil lay in its simplicity. By mid-1943, the machine had begun to devour itself. To hide the evidence, bodies were dug up and burned. Records were destroyed. Witnesses were executed. The camps that once screamed with noise fell eerily quiet. But the silence could not erase what had been done. The soil was heavy with bone and ash. Birds refused to nest in the trees above the killing pits. Even decades later, when archaeologists would dig there, they would find layers of gray earth that smelled faintly of oil and death. The machinery of death was both the apex and the downfall of Operation Reinhard. It showed how far the human mind could go in pursuit of control, how easily compassion could be replaced by efficiency. It was the perfect reflection of a regime that valued order above life, precision above morality. And though its engines have long since gone silent, the echo remains. In reports, in survivor testimonies, in the haunted landscapes of Poland where the ground still remembers. The trains would stop eventually. The guards would flee. The buildings would be dismantled, the signs taken down. But the machinery, the idea that murder could be organized, that extermination could be executed with a detachment of bureaucracy, that would outlive the war. It became a warning carved into history itself, a reminder that evil rarely announces itself with screams. Sometimes it begins with a clipboard, a schedule, and the calm hum of an engine that never should have started. Chapter 8. The Looting of a Nation. It was not enough for the Nazi regime to kill. They wanted to profit from it. Every transport that arrived at Belzec, Sobibor, or Treblinka carried more than human beings. It carried the possessions of a nation. Gold, currency, jewelry, clothing, utensils, watches, shoes, documents, photographs, even hair. In their hunger for annihilation, the Nazis discovered something obscene. Genocide could be monetized. Behind every trainload of victims, there was an army of accountants, warehouse clerks, and SS officers waiting to strip the dead of everything they owned. Operation Reinhard was not only a machine of death, it was a system of organized theft. In the shadows of cremation smoke, an empire of looting was born. From the start, Odilo Globoknik understood that the destruction of the Jews could also enrich the Reich. He called it recycling resources. His office in Lublin became the central hub for all property seized from the murdered. It began with the smallest items, rings, coins, watches, but soon grew into an operation so vast that it required entire warehouses, accounting ledgers, and transport routes to handle the flow. In bureaucratic reports, it was referred to as Wertheim, the collection of valuables. In reality, it was the plundering of an entire people. Every object taken represented a human life extinguished, and Globoknik made sure nothing went to waste. When victims arrived at the camps, their possessions were the first to die. Luggage was taken as soon as they stepped off the train. Women's handbags were emptied and thrown into piles. Men's coats were stripped of wallets and buttons. The guards moved quickly, methodically, like workers on an assembly line. They had done it 100 times before. The items were sorted into categories: currency, jewelry, textiles, food, tools, and clothing. The sound of this sorting was its own kind of music, the rustle of fabric, the jingle of coins, the crackle of paper. It was the soundtrack of theft on an unimaginable scale. The deception was perfect. Victims were told to mark their bags for identification, to tie their shoes together so they wouldn't be lost, to remember where they left their valuables. They were told these things to keep them calm, to keep the system running. They followed the instructions, believing they would retrieve their belongings after delousing. But the moment the gas chamber doors closed, their property belonged to the Reich. Within hours, the clothes were being washed, the gold melted, the cash counted. It was as if death itself had been turned into commerce. The scale of this plunder astonished even those who managed it. In a single month in 1942, the Lublin headquarters processed hundreds of thousands of marks in cash, along with gold coins, silver jewelry, and diamonds. The numbers rose so high that accountants ran out of ledgers. The SS hired civilian experts to handle the valuation. They worked in quiet offices, tallying the spoils of genocide as though they were managing a bank. Some even received bonuses for exceeding quotas. It was a bureaucratic miracle of evil, a seamless merger between murder and profit. Every step of the process was catalogued. After sorting, the valuables were shipped to depots in Lublin or Krakow, then on to Berlin. The gold was melted down at the Reichsbank, turned into bars stamped with the eagle of the Third Reich. Currency from all over Europe, zloty, francs, drachma, lira, was exchanged and absorbed into the Nazi economy. Clothing and shoes were disinfected and sent to German civilians, especially in bombed cities where shortages had become dire. Officials proudly reported that recycled clothing from the East was helping our people at home. They never mentioned that those clothes still smelled faintly of smoke and fear. Nothing was too small to be stolen. False teeth were extracted from the mouths of the dead and melted for gold. Eyeglasses were collected by the tens of thousands. Human hair, shorn from women and children before gassing, was washed, dried, and packed into bales. It was sold to factories that used it for felt and mattress stuffing. In German factories, workers slept on pillows filled with the hair of the murdered, unaware, or pretending to be unaware, of its origin. Even ashes were sifted for jewelry that had survived the fires. In the logic of the SS, every body had a price. Globoknik's men were rewarded for their efficiency. Officers sent reports to Himmler boasting about the financial results of Operation Reinhard. They spoke of profit margins and collections in language borrowed from commerce. One memorandum proudly declared that the assets of the Jewish population have been transferred for the benefit of the Reich. Himmler approved bonuses for those who managed the operation well. To him, this was the victory of German order over Jewish chaos, the conversion of waste into wealth. The perversion of ideology and economy was complete. In the Lublin district, warehouses expanded to accommodate the avalanche of goods. Prisoners were forced to work inside them, sorting, cleaning, and repackaging the stolen property. They handled the belongings of their own people, recognizing the names sewn into garments, the familiar stitching of a neighbor's coat. Every item was a ghost. Every suitcase opened revealed a piece of a vanished life. A family photograph, a prayer book, a child's drawing. The prisoners wept quietly as they worked, because to stop was to die. The guards beat them for slowing down. The sorting floors became graveyards of identity, each pile of possessions a silent mass grave. The stolen wealth flowed outward like blood through arteries. The Reichsbank in Berlin became the final destination. Special trains carried the loot, guarded by SS men armed with machine guns. Accountants logged each shipment, weighing gold bars, counting banknotes, recording jewelry by carat. To the clerks who received it, the shipments were just another entry. They did not ask where it came from. The Nazi state had found a way to hide theft inside legality, murder inside paperwork. The words "for the benefit of the German people" appeared on every document. Some of the plunder was redistributed directly to SS personnel. Watches and rings became common gifts. Fur coats were presented to officers' wives. Shoes and clothes went to German settlers in occupied Poland. Nothing went to waste. In camps like Majdanek, workshops repaired clothing and removed labels. The prisoners who worked there had to cut out the names of the dead, erasing the last proof that those garments had ever belonged to someone else. The theft of property was the final step in the theft of identity. Even the economic planners in Berlin marveled at the results. They realized that Operation Reinhard was not only solving what they called the Jewish question, but also strengthening the Reich's finances. War was expensive, and genocide was paying for it. Globoknik bragged that the proceeds of the operation were funding the construction of new SS housing and military projects. The numbers seemed to justify everything. To the men who ran the system, killing had become an industry, and business was good. Yet beneath the statistics, the reality was grotesque. The camps reeked of decay. In the sorting yards, rats nested among shoes and clothing. Prisoners scavenged scraps of food from the belongings of the dead. Guards laughed as they pocketed stolen jewelry, sometimes fighting each other over it. Corruption spread quickly. Even within the SS, greed undermined discipline. Some officers stole gold for themselves. Others smuggled watches or gems home in letters. Investigations were launched, but most were quietly dropped. The theft was too vast to police. The line between sanctioned plunder and personal crime disappeared. The victims' lives were reduced to numbers on ledgers, yet their presence haunted everything the Nazis touched. A dress worn by a German woman might have belonged to a child from Krakow. A ring on an SS wife's finger might have been torn from a corpse at Treblinka. The regime tried to sanitize the process with words like property transfer and resource allocation, but no amount of language could disguise the stench of burning bodies that accompanied the wealth. The moral rot seeped into every level of society. The gold in the Reichsbank glimmered with ash. In the ghettos that remained, the Jews who had not yet been deported began to understand the full scope of what was happening. They saw their neighbors vanish, and later saw their belongings for sale in German markets. Hope began to die in them long before the trains came. The world that had once been theirs was now feeding the empire that hunted them. And yet, even as everything was stripped away, they clung to small acts of defiance, burying family heirlooms, hiding religious items, scribbling names on scraps of paper. They wanted proof to outlast the thieves. When the Red Army eventually liberated Poland, they found warehouses filled with evidence of this looting. Mountains of shoes, glasses, combs, baby clothes, hair, and teeth. The sight defied belief. Each object was a voice that could no longer speak. Allied investigators traced the flow of gold from those warehouses to the Reichsbank vaults in Berlin, then to Swiss banks and private collectors. The trail was long, but the conclusion was clear. The Nazi state had turned robbery into state policy. The extermination camps were not just killing centers. They were economic engines. In later years, during post-war trials, survivors and officials alike would describe this machinery of theft. A few SS officers tried to justify it, claiming the property no longer belonged to anyone. Others insisted they were merely following orders. None could hide the truth that greed had fused seamlessly with ideology. The final solution was not just about racial purity. It was about profit, power, and possession. By looting the Jews, the Nazis believed they were reclaiming wealth that had never truly belonged to them. It was the oldest anti-Semitic myth, transformed into government policy. But theft has a way of marking its perpetrators. Those who profited from the dead carried their ghosts with them. The rings they wore, the coats they gifted, the gold they counted, each was a silent accusation. Some officers burned their uniforms when the war ended. Others buried their loot in the ground. When captured, many denied everything. But the evidence was everywhere, etched into the ledgers, the rail records, the reports stamped top secret. History itself became the witness that none of them could silence. The looting of a nation did more than enrich the Reich. It destroyed its soul. It proved that evil could disguise itself as efficiency, that theft could be disguised as policy. It showed how easily civilization can collapse into barbarism when morality is replaced by profit. In the smoke rising from the death camps, Germany's wealth glowed for a brief, terrible moment. But it was wealth built on ashes, and no empire can stand forever on the bones of the murdered. When the war finally ended and the Reich lay in ruins, the gold and jewels that had once flowed through Globoknik's warehouses were scattered or lost. Some of it was recovered. Much of it was gone forever. But the memory remained, in photographs of piles of shoes, in inventories found in abandoned offices, in the testimonies of those who had been forced to sort through the belongings of the dead. The Nazis had tried to strip their victims of everything, their lives, their dignity, their names. Yet what they could not erase was the evidence of their own greed. Long after the camps were destroyed, farmers near the sites continued to find fragments in the soil, buttons, coins, bits of glass, wedding rings pressed into the earth by time and fire. They were reminders that even in death, the victims refused to disappear. The land itself rejected the silence. Each discovery was a whisper, a faint echo of a voice that once spoke a language of love, family, and faith. It was proof that no amount of looting, no wealth, no empire could erase the truth of what happened. The looting of a nation was not an accident of war. It was a mirror of it. It revealed the moral vacuum at the heart of the Nazi project, where even death became an opportunity for profit. Operation Reinhard was more than a genocide. It was a harvest, a grotesque attempt to turn human beings into commodities. They succeeded only in proving one thing: that greed, when given the power of law, can devour a world faster than any army. And when the smoke of the furnaces finally cleared, all that remained was silence. The silence of things that should never have been taken, and the silence of lives that should never have been lost. Chapter 9. The Silence of the Locals. It hung in the air like fog, the kind of silence that hides more than it reveals. In the villages surrounding Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, the mornings began as they always had. Roosters crowed, carts rattled along dirt roads, smoke rose from chimneys. But beneath that thin skin of normality, something was wrong. The forest no longer sounded right. Birds avoided certain clearings. The wind carried a different smell, sharp and metallic, and sometimes, when the breeze shifted, it brought a bitterness no one could mistake. People looked up from their fields and paused, then returned to work without a word. They did not ask what was happening in the forests. They already knew enough not to. Fear was the currency of those years. The Germans ruled by it, and the people survived by it. The villages near the camps, places like Wolkero-Kraglik, Sobibor, Poniatoa, found themselves living beside a secret they could never speak aloud. The locals saw trains coming and going at strange hours, sometimes 2 or 3 a day. The windows of those trains were boarded up, and the cars were sealed. From inside came no voices, only the occasional thud, a cry, or the muffled sound of prayer. At first, villagers believed the passengers were being sent east for labor. But soon, they noticed something that didn't fit. The trains arrived full and left empty. At night, the sky glowed faintly red above the forests. The smell of burning spread for miles, mixing with the scent of pine. Even animals grew restless. Dogs barked toward the direction of the camps, and then fell silent. When farmers rode to market, they passed soldiers guarding new fences, men in gray uniforms with the black lightning bolts of the SS. A few brave souls asked questions, but the answers were always the same: military zone. Keep moving. Some were beaten for pressing further. Others disappeared altogether. Fear spread like frost, thin and unspoken, coating everything. The Germans had built their killing grounds in remote places for a reason. They wanted the world to look away. They chose forests, marshes, and rail junctions far from cities. But the countryside was never truly empty. Peasants gathered wood nearby. Shepherds grazed livestock. Railway workers maintained the tracks. All of them saw pieces of the truth. Too many to remain ignorant. Too few to fully grasp the scale. The people of Poland lived beside genocide, trapped between knowledge and survival. They heard the trains. They smelled the smoke. They saw the clothes of the dead being sold in markets. But to speak of it was to risk joining them. Some tried to convince themselves that it couldn't be what it seemed. They wanted to believe the Germans were relocating people, not killing them. It was easier to believe a lie than to face a horror beyond imagination. Others knew, but chose to remain silent. A farmer who saw ashes in his fields would plow them under. A washerwoman who found a blood-stained coat in a second-hand pile would wash it and say nothing. The war had turned every moral act into a risk. And when death watches every doorway, silence becomes the only refuge left. Still, rumors spread like wildfire, carried by travelers, whispered in churches, murmured across fences. They are burning people in the woods, someone would say. The trains go in but don't come back. A priest might hear confessions from a soldier who had seen too much, or a station master might tell his wife what he witnessed of the sighting. But those stories stayed inside walls and under blankets, told in whispers only at night. The world had become divided between those who knew and those who pretended not to. The Germans ensured that silence was enforced not just by fear, but by complicity. They paid locals to guard supply depots, to maintain fences, to deliver food to the camps. They hired carpenters to repair barracks, tailors to mend uniforms, blacksmiths to fix wagons. Many took the jobs because they had no choice. The war had starved them. Work meant survival. A man could tell himself he was only mending a fence, not building a prison. A woman could tell herself she was only sewing, not preparing uniforms for murderers. In occupied Poland, innocence was a luxury few could afford. Yet the silence was not absolute. There were moments when humanity broke through the fear. Some villagers left bread or milk near the train tracks, hoping starving prisoners would find it. Others smuggled information to the underground, describing the smoke and the ash that drifted into their wells. Resistance groups in Warsaw began to receive reports of mass killings near Lublin and Treblinka. The Polish Home Army compiled them into documents, sending them through secret channels to London. But the Allied world dismissed them at first. The idea that millions were being gassed seemed too monstrous to be real. The silence of disbelief was as deadly as the silence of fear. In the villages, the horror became part of the landscape. People learned to recognize the sound of certain trains, the heavy rumble of deportation convoys distinct from freight. Children grew up watching soldiers escort endless lines of people through their streets. Sometimes, they found objects along the roadside, coins, letters, photographs that had fallen from the transports. Those small artifacts became ghostly reminders of lives erased just beyond the trees. Many villagers buried what they found, not to hide it from guilt, but to protect it from desecration. They sensed that one day, someone would need proof. The Germans discouraged any curiosity with ruthless precision. Warning signs in German and Polish were nailed to trees around the camps. Any civilian approaching the perimeter will be shot. Patrols roamed the forest roads. Farmers caught within a kilometer were beaten, sometimes executed as spies. Station masters were ordered not to record certain trains, and railway workers who talked too much were sent to forced labor. The machinery of death depended not just on its guards, but on a ring of enforced ignorance. Everyone was watched. Everyone was afraid. There were also those who chose to profit. Some scavenged near the camps, looking for valuables among the discarded clothes. These gold hunters, as they were later called, dug into burial sites after transports had passed, searching for rings or teeth missed by the SS. Their presence was a grotesque echo of the plunder happening within the camps. For them, war had stripped away morality. They lived like shadows, circling the perimeter of hell, sustained by greed and desperation. Even after the war, the ground would still bear marks of their digging, a scar on the conscience of the land itself. The silence of the locals was not a single silence. It was many. There was the silence of fear, the silence of complicity, the silence of grief, and the silence of survival. Mothers hushed children when they asked about the strange smell. Priests prayed without mentioning what they knew. Teachers avoided questions. The villagers became actors in a play none of them had chosen, where every word could be fatal. Yet behind closed doors, people wept for neighbors who had vanished. They looked toward the forests and crossed themselves, whispering prayers for the unseen dead. In some towns, the Germans forced locals to help in the cleanup after liquidations. When ghettos were emptied, villagers were ordered to gather the belongings left behind. They saw the small tragedies up close. Toys in the street, shoes too tiny to fit anyone alive. Some stole what they could carry. Others turned away in horror. The lines between guilt and innocence blurred until no one could tell where survival ended and complicity began. But silence, even the thickest, cannot last forever. Word of the extermination camps spread through occupied Europe. Couriers from the Polish underground brought reports to the Vatican, to Switzerland, to London. In November 1942, the Allied governments officially acknowledged the mass killings, yet the war went on. For the people living near the camps, The silence deepened into numbness. The killings became routine. The sky glowed red so often that they stopped looking. The smoke became part of the weather. The unnatural became ordinary. Children born during those years grew up never knowing a world without fear. They learned early which roads not to take, which topics not to mention. Some played near the railway lines, collecting scraps of metal, unaware of what those rails carried. Others remembered the trains with terror, the sound of them, the way the ground shook, the smell that followed. Those memories stayed with them long after the war, like ghosts that refused to fade. When the Germans began dismantling the camps in late 1943, the villagers saw it too. They watched as buildings were torn down, as the fences were pulled apart, as the earth was dug up again. They saw prisoners forced to exhume corpses and burn them, and then they saw those prisoners marched away to their own deaths. Soon after, the sites were plowed over, trees replanted, farms built where mass graves had been. The silence deepened once more, not of fear this time, but of denial. People wanted to forget. The ground was green again, the air clean, but underneath, the earth still breathed ash. After the war, when Soviet and Polish investigators came to these villages, they found the silence still there. Questions met with shrugs. We didn't know. We couldn't help. Some told the truth, others hid behind ignorance. For many, the memories were too heavy to carry, and forgetting was a kind of mercy. But history has a way of uncovering what silence buries. As the decades passed, testimonies emerged. Farmers who had seen trains, children who had smelled the smoke, railway workers who had watched without speaking. Each confession chipped away at the wall of denial, revealing a truth too large to fit inside any one life. The silence of the locals was not cowardice alone. It was the reflection of a world conquered by terror. In a landscape where every whisper could kill, speech became an act of rebellion. But silence, even when born of fear, carries guilt with it. The people who lived beside the camps bore that guilt quietly for the rest of their lives. Some fled the villages after the war, unable to endure the memories. Others stayed, haunted by sounds that no longer existed. On windy nights, they swore they could still hear trains in the distance, still smell the faint bitterness in the air. In the end, silence became another victim of Operation Reinhard. It was the invisible thread that held the system together, the unspoken agreement that made murder possible in plain sight. Without it, the camps could never have functioned so smoothly. The Germans built the machinery, but silence was its lubricant. It seeped into every corner of occupied Poland, numbing hearts and paralyzing tongues. It lingered long after the war, passed down through generations as an inherited unease, a quiet knowledge that the ground beneath their feet had once trembled with horror. And yet, silence can be broken. When survivors returned, when witnesses spoke, when historians dug into the soil and found bones and buttons, the silence began to crack. The land that had swallowed screams started to give them back. It whispered through the relics unearthed, through the rusted rails and melted glass. It told the world that the villagers had lived beside death itself, caught between helplessness and guilt. They were not executioners, but they were witnesses. And in history, witness is a heavy word. The silence of the locals was not just the story of one generation. It was the story of how ordinary people live next to horror and still call it life. It was the silence of survival, the silence of fear, and the silence that history must never allow to return. Because silence, left unchecked, is not peace, it is permission. And the world has already seen what grows from that. Chapter 10, The Uprising Flames. The morning of revolt began like every other, quiet, orderly, suffocatingly normal. The guards drank coffee in the mess hall. The prisoners moved in silence, sweeping the yard, carrying tools, pretending not to see the rifles glinting in the sun. The engines were still. The smoke hung low and gray over the clearing. At Sobibor, as in Treblinka before it, everything appeared to be under control. But beneath that fragile calm, something was shifting. A pulse had begun to beat, slow at first, then faster, echoing through the hearts of men who had been condemned to die. After months of silence and submission, after days measured in screams and ash, they were ready to burn the machine that devoured them. They were ready to fight. For weeks, whispers had spread among the prisoners. A mechanic here, a carpenter there, each one testing trust, trading words like contraband. They spoke in code, in fragments, under the eyes of guards who saw nothing but obedience. At first, the idea of rebellion seemed impossible. The camp was surrounded by fences, watchtowers, and minefields. Beyond the trees, German patrols prowled the roads. Escape was madness. But what was madness in a place built on death? They had seen too much to stay still any longer. They knew their turn would come soon. The camp was being emptied, prisoners disappearing in small groups, shot quietly in the forest. It was only a matter of time before there would be no one left to resist. So, they decided to die on their own terms, fighting. The spark came from within. In Sobibor, that spark had a name, Alexander Petrovsky, a Soviet Jewish POW captured at Minsk and brought to the camp in September 1943. A tall, calm man with military bearing, Petrovsky brought something the prisoners had almost forgotten: discipline, strategy, purpose. He had survived the front, survived captivity, survived the death trains. Now, faced with the impossible, he spoke words that reignited hope. "If we are to die," he said, "let us die with honor." The men around him, carpenters, tailors, laborers, listened in silence. It was not courage that filled them, but necessity. Planning the revolt required deception as precise as the Germans' own. Petrovsky and his small group studied every detail of the camp's routine. They counted guards, noted shift changes, tracked when weapons were cleaned, when officers took their meals, when the gates opened for deliveries. The plan they built was simple in design, but staggering in its risk. They would lure guards into workshops one by one, kill them silently with knives and axes, seize their weapons, cut the phone lines, and then storm the main gate. If all went well, hundreds could escape into the forest before reinforcements arrived. If it failed, they would all be dead within minutes. But in Sobibor, death was already certain. Failure simply meant dying sooner. In the days leading to the revolt, every gesture, every breath became an act of performance. Prisoners continued their work as usual, mending boots, sawing wood, sorting clothes, while secretly stockpiling tools that could serve as weapons. A file became a blade. A hammer became a signal. A length of wire became a garrote. They smuggled messages between barracks, hidden inside bread or under floorboards. They rehearsed in whispers, using hand signs and coded phrases. One man volunteered to stand guard at the carpentry shop. Another memorized the timing of the watchtower rotation. The women played a vital role too, distracting guards, passing notes, calming the terrified. Every life in the camp became a part of the plan. October 14th, 1943. The day dawned cold, still, and deceptively ordinary. The prisoners went about their assigned tasks. Around 3 in the afternoon, the first act of rebellion began. SS officer Johann Niemann entered the tailor's workshop to inspect a new uniform. As he leaned forward to try it on, a prisoner struck him with an axe. The blow split his skull cleanly. The body was dragged behind a pile of clothes and hidden. A few minutes later, another officer was summoned to the cobbler's shed to collect a pair of boots. He too never walked out. Across the camp, similar scenes unfolded. Quiet murders performed with terrible precision. Within 30 minutes, 11 German officers were dead. The prisoners felt the world tilt in that silence between heartbeats. The impossible was happening. Then came the moment that shattered the quiet. A gunshot rang out. A guard had discovered one of the bodies. The alarm spread instantly, the camp erupting into chaos. Prisoners shouted, "Hurrah! Hurrah! Freedom!" Some ran for the gate, others for the fences. Petrovsky yelled for everyone to move. Gunfire cracked from the watchtowers. The air filled with screams, smoke, and confusion. Some men threw themselves onto the barbed wire, holding it down so others could climb over. Mines exploded in the clearing, tearing holes in the air. It was no longer a plan. It was desperation turned into motion. Those who ran carried the memory of the dead with them. Those who stayed behind fought until they fell. Outside the gates, the forest awaited, a labyrinth of trees, a maze of hope and terror. The escapees ran in all directions, chased by bullets and shouts. Some fell immediately, others vanished into the dark. Dogs were released, and the Germans followed with trucks. But the forest swallowed many. They waded through swamps, crawled through mud, tore their clothes on branches. Night fell, and with it came the cold. Out of roughly 600 prisoners, about 300 made it beyond the fences. Of those, less than 50 would survive until the end of the war. Yet for those 50, survival meant something more than life. It meant testimony. The Sobibor uprising was not the first, nor the last. At Treblinka, months earlier, a similar storm had erupted. The revolt began on August 2nd, 1943. The prisoners there had planned in secret for weeks, led by men like Leon Feldhendler and Samuel Rajman. They stole keys, copied them in wax, and made wooden molds to forge duplicates. They smuggled small arms, grenades, and gasoline. Their plan, like Sobibor's, was born of desperation and defiance. On that scorching summer day, with the guards distracted by heat and boredom, they set their camp ablaze. Flames devoured the barracks. The gunfire was deafening. The prisoners charged the gates in waves. Around 300 escaped into the surrounding fields, though many were cut down by machine guns. Still, the fire they started did not die. It spread, carried by those who lived to tell what they had seen. The uprisings were acts of pure rebellion against inevitability. They were not military victories. They were moral ones. In places designed to erase humanity, men and women reclaimed it with their final breath. The SS called them criminals, saboteurs, traitors. But history would remember them as something else, witnesses. Their defiance shattered the illusion of total control. The Nazi system depended on silence and compliance. In those moments of revolt, silence was replaced by the one sound the regime feared most: the sound of the condemned refusing to die quietly. After the Sobibor uprising, the Germans reacted with fury. SS reinforcements flooded the area. The camp was sealed off, and every surviving prisoner inside was executed. Within weeks, Himmler ordered the camp dismantled. Buildings were torn down, the ground plowed, and trees planted over the site. A farmhouse was built, just as it had been at Belzec and Treblinka. The Nazis wanted to erase every trace, but they could not erase what had already escaped into the world: the story. For the survivors, freedom was not the end. It was another kind of prison. They were hunted relentlessly. Many joined partisan groups in the forests, continuing the fight against the Germans. Others wandered from village to village, starving and alone. Some were killed by collaborators or betrayed for a bag of flour. A few made it to Soviet lines or Allied camps, carrying with them fragments of the uprising, the names of friends who had fallen, the smell of smoke in their clothes, the knowledge that they had struck back, even for a moment, against the empire that sought to erase them. Years later, when the survivors told their stories, their voices trembled not from fear, but from memory. They spoke of the decision to fight, the moments before the first axe fell, the chaos of the escape. They remembered faces, names, voices that had vanished. One man recalled seeing the gate explode under pressure, the world opening for the first time in months. Another remembered the sound of a German shouting orders as he bled out in the dirt. Those memories were fragments of light breaking through the darkness, a reminder that even in a place built for death, life still had the strength to resist. Historians would later describe these uprisings as the first organized revolts in extermination camps. But they were more than that. They were acts of spiritual rebellion. They proved that even under absolute control, the human can still rebel. The men and women who rose in Sobibor and Treblinka were not soldiers. They were witnesses of a moral truth, that to fight, even without hope, is to reclaim humanity from the hands of those who would erase it. The SS tried to learn from the revolts, tightening security in remaining camps. But the damage was done. Word of the uprisings spread across the occupied territories. In ghettos and labor camps, in hiding places, whispers of resistance grew louder. If people could escape from death itself, perhaps survival was possible. The flames of Sobibor and Treblinka reached beyond Poland, igniting hope in those who still lived under the shadow of annihilation. When the war ended, few of the uprising survivors remained to speak, but their stories became testaments. Alexander Petrovsky lived to see the collapse of the Reich. He carried the memory of his comrades, never calling himself a hero, only a soldier who refused to die a slave. Leon Feldhendler did not live long after the war. He was murdered in Lublin in 1945, but his name endured in every retelling of Treblinka's defiance. Their courage had not saved their people, but it had restored something that the Nazis thought they had destroyed forever: the possibility of dignity amid horror. Today, when one stands in the forest where Sobibor once stood, the air still feels heavy. The birds sing, the grass grows, but there is a strange stillness beneath it all. It is as if the earth itself remembers the fire, the footsteps, the screams. In that soil lies both the memory of death and the seed of rebellion. The uprising was a moment when history bent, when the machinery of annihilation met the human instinct to resist. For a few burning hours, the killers lost control. The victims seized the power to decide how they would die, and in doing so, they changed what it meant to live. The flames of Sobibor and Treblinka were more than smoke and destruction. They were symbols, proof that even within the walls of hell, freedom could be imagined, and courage could still take shape. In those moments of revolt, humanity reasserted itself against the abyss. And though most of those who rose perished within days or weeks, their defiance echoed through history, whispering a truth the Nazis could never extinguish: that no system, no ideology, no machinery of death can ever fully conquer the human spirit. As the fires burned out and the forests closed around the ruins, the sky above Poland grew quiet again. But beneath that silence, something enduring had been born. The uprising flames were more than rebellion. They were remembrance. They were the heartbeat of every survivor who walked out of the camps, every witness who refused to let the world forget. And though the camps themselves were torn down, though the earth was turned and the trees planted over the graves, the fire they lit has never gone out. It burns still, in memory, in history, and in the unyielding truth that even in the darkest hour of mankind, courage is possible. Chapter 11. The Erasure of Evidence. The wind that once carried the smell of burning flesh now carried something different: fear. The year was 1943, and the front was shifting. The Red Army was advancing westward, German lines collapsing mile by mile. For the architects of Operation Reinhard, that meant one thing: the time of secrets was running out. The camps that had murdered over 1 million souls could not simply vanish from memory, but the SS intended to make it look as if they had. The extermination network that once thrived on efficiency now turned its own precision inward, devouring itself, burying its own crimes under layers of soil and deception. The same men who had engineered the mass killing now became engineers of disappearance. The final operation had begun, an operation to erase truth itself. It started with orders whispered in Lublin. Odilo Globoknik, the overseer of Reinhard, received instructions directly from Himmler. All traces of the extermination camps were to be destroyed. The command was clear and urgent. Nothing must remain to show what was done here. Bureaucratic language cloaked the terror beneath it. The words meant that thousands of bodies had to be unearthed, burned, and ground into ash. It meant the landscape itself had to be rewritten, the bones of the murdered turned into dust that could no longer testify. What had once been built to kill was now repurposed to hide the killing. The orders spread quickly to Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. The men who received them did not hesitate. They had followed orders to kill. They would now follow orders to erase. At first, the work seemed impossible. The mass graves were immense. Long trenches holding tens of thousands of corpses each. The stench was overwhelming. Flies and maggots swarmed over the ground. When the first graves were opened, even the hardened SS men gagged and turned away. The corpses had turned gray and waxy, their faces bloated but strangely preserved in the oxygen-starved soil. The air became thick with decay. Yet under threat of death, the prisoners, those few still alive, were forced to begin the grim work. They dug under watch of machine guns. Every shovelful brought up horror. The earth was soft and greasy, heavy with human fat that had seeped from the decomposing bodies. They unearthed layers of limbs, skulls, tangled hair. Some recognized faces among the dead. Family members, friends, people they had once whispered to in line. There was no time for mourning. The SS shouted for speed. Trenches were widened into pits. Grates made of railway tracks were erected over them, supported by concrete blocks. The bodies were piled in alternating layers. Logs, corpses, logs. Then gasoline was poured and fires set. Flames leapt high into the sky, feeding on years of silence. The infernos burned for days, turning flesh to ash and bones to powder. The task had a name, Sonderaction 1005. It was the Reich's most secret operation, supervised by SS Standard Paul Blobel. A man of icy detachment, Blobel viewed the project as a technical challenge. How to burn thousands efficiently. How to crush bones so that no trace remained. He ordered the construction of crushing machines, improvised from heavy rollers and concrete slabs. Prisoners were forced to grind bones by hand with hammers and shovels. They sifted the ashes for gold teeth, melting them into bars for shipment back to Berlin. The fires left the ground blackened and oily. Even rain could not wash away the smell. At Treblinka, the process began in the summer heat of 1943. The camp was already a graveyard, silent but for the crackle of flames. The prisoners worked under guard, the smoke stinging their eyes, their skin burned raw. They used hooks to pull bodies apart, breaking the rigor of the dead to fit them onto the pyres. Each day, new piles of ash were carried away in wheelbarrows, scattered into the surrounding forest, or dumped into the Bug River. The SS kept records even of this destruction. How many graves opened? How many cubic meters of ash dispersed? Bureaucracy persisted, even at the edge of hell. The purpose was not merely to hide the evidence from advancing armies, but to cleanse the conscience of the Reich. Himmler feared the reaction of history. He knew the world would not understand. He wanted the killing remembered only as rumor, deniable, distant. A glorious page of history, he called it once, that must never be written. The irony was cruel. He wanted to preserve pride while erasing proof. So the very men who had built the machine of death now turned shovels against their own handiwork, scrubbing the world of their fingerprints. In Sobibor, the cleanup began after the uprising. The revolt had shaken the SS deeply. They dismantled the camp piece by piece. Fences, barracks, watchtowers, everything reduced to fragments. The gas chambers were destroyed, their bricks reused to build a farmhouse. The well was filled with rubble and lime. A single Ukrainian family was settled on the site, their livestock grazing over what had once been a killing ground. To a passerby, it looked like an ordinary farm. Only the soil betrayed it, gray, granular, filled with ash. When it rained, the ground bled. Belzec's transformation was even more complete. Of all the Reinhard camps, it was the first to close and the first to be buried under silence. The Germans leveled it in 1943, long before the war's end. Locals who passed by noticed that the earth there was strange. It sank when walked upon. It smelled of burning, even in winter. But the Germans plowed it flat, planted lupins and pine trees, and posted guards to keep people away. They had turned a place of extermination into a garden of deceit. To this day, not a single photograph exists of Belzec in operation. It is the ghost camp, the one that almost disappeared completely, saved only by survivor memories and the Earth's refusal to stay quiet. The erasure of evidence extended beyond the camps. The SS hunted down anyone who had worked there and might talk. Many Ukrainian guards were sent to the front or executed to tie off loose ends. Paper trails were destroyed, transport lists, correspondence, requisitions. Yet no bureaucracy dies quietly. Fragments survived in archives, in train schedules, in coded telegrams. The Nazis, obsessed with record-keeping, could not fully undo their own orderliness. History would later reconstruct the truth from these shards. But in those final months, they believed they had succeeded. The prisoners forced to work in the cleanup crews knew they were doomed. They understood that once the graves were burned and the camps demolished, there would be no reason to keep them alive. They tried to resist in small ways, burying notes in bottles, scratching names into trees, leaving messages hidden in ash. One note found decades later near Treblinka read, "Here we burn thousands. May the future remember." The handwriting trembled, the words half-faded, but the meaning was clear, a final cry from those erased twice, once in life and again in death. As the fires raged, the landscape changed. Forest around the camps turned gray from soot. The rivers grew thick with residue. Birds avoided the air above the burning sites. Even the seasons seemed warped. Summer refused to feel like summer. The sky stayed a dull color, as if mourning. Locals watched from a distance, unable to approach, but unable to look away. They saw smoke without source, fire without flame. The Germans spread rumors that they were burning trash or diseased animals. But everyone knew the truth, and the truth hung heavy over every field and road. By the autumn of 1943, Operation Reinhard itself was officially declared complete. Himmler congratulated Globoknik in a private letter, thanking him for a task well performed. The task, of course, was genocide. Globoknik sent a final report listing every item recovered: tons of gold, kilograms of silver, thousands of watches, millions of zloty. There was no mention of the dead. The same letter also confirmed the destruction of the camps. The installations have been dismantled, it read, and the terrain leveled and camouflaged. It was bureaucratic closure to one of history's greatest crimes. But history has a way of preserving what men try to destroy. When the Soviets reached the sites in 1944, they found the land disturbed. The plowed fields looked too smooth, too deliberate. Digging revealed layers of ash and bone fragments, shards of skull, bits of jaw, melted glass from cremation fires. The earth still held the evidence that no amount of deception could erase. Even today, the soil at Belzec in Treblinka glitters faintly under the sun, tiny white specks that are not stones but the remains of ground bone. The past refuses to stay buried. The SS men who oversaw the erasures did not live peacefully. Many were captured, tried, or hunted down after the war. Paul Blobel, the man who directed Sonderaction 1005, was hanged after the Nuremberg trials. Christian Wirth was killed by partisans before the war ended. Franz Stangl, the commandant of Treblinka, escaped to Brazil but was caught decades later. When asked in prison if he felt guilt, he answered coldly, "My conscience is clear. I was only doing my duty." Those words became the final echo of a system built on obedience and denial, the moral void that made erasure possible. Yet not all of them escaped their memories. Some of the guards who survived spoke years later, their testimonies filled with confusion and contradiction. They described the fires, the stench, the endless piles of bones. They said they dreamed of it still, the gray sky that never cleared, the ash that clung to their boots. The act of erasing had not freed them. It had chained them to their own horror. They had tried to make the evidence disappear, but in doing so, they had buried it inside themselves. The attempt to erase the Holocaust's physical traces failed, but its moral echoes endure. The world nearly lost these stories to time and silence. For decades, the fields where the Reinhard camps once stood were neglected, overgrown, forgotten. It took survivors, historians, and archaeologists years to bring their truth back to light. They dug carefully, uncovering the outlines of gas chambers, fragments of tiles, bullet casings, personal belongings. A child's shoe, a comb, a key. Each discovery became a voice from the ash, proof that the past could not be buried forever. In the end, the SS succeeded in destroying their camps, but not their evidence. The true record lay not in paper, but in the land itself, in the chemical composition of the soil, in the traces of phosphorus and calcium that no plow could erase. Scientists studying the sites decades later would find exact boundaries where human ash replaced dirt. The forests that were meant to conceal became memorials. The earth that was supposed to forget turned into witness. The erasure of evidence was the final cruelty of Operation Reinhard, a last insult to the dead, an attempt to deny them even the dignity of memory. But it failed. The truth survived in fragments, in testimony, in the unquiet soil. And perhaps that is the greatest revenge against the men who built those fires, that they could destroy bodies, but not history, burn names, but not remembrance. When the wind blows across the forests of eastern Poland today, it carries whispers from beneath the trees. They are not ghosts, but echoes of the past refusing silence. The Nazis tried to erase their crimes. Instead, they carved them into the conscience of humanity. The fires they built to hide their sins lit the path for future generations to find them. And in that eternal irony lies the final judgment, not from gods or tribunals, but from the memory of the world itself. Chapter 12. The Reckoning of Witnesses. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world exhaled. But it was not relief, it was disbelief. Europe lay in ruins, cities hollowed by fire and grief. And yet, amid the rubble and the victory parades, there remained places where no banner could fly, no anthem could sound. The forests of Poland still hid their secret graves, their soil heavy with ash. The camps of Operation Reinhard, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, had been dismantled, their witnesses scattered or silenced. But the silence itself began to break. From the smoke and bones, from the few who had survived, came voices that refused to stay buried. It was the beginning of a reckoning, the moment when memory rose to confront denial. The first to speak were the ghosts in flesh, the survivors who had escaped the impossible. They emerged from forests, from villages, from foreign lands where they had hidden their names. Some were skeletal, others blank-eyed with trauma. Many had not spoken for years, their tongues stiff with fear. When they began to talk, the words came haltingly, like stones being lifted from a grave. They described trains that arrived full and left empty, fields that moved when the wind blew because they were made of ashes, the smell that never left their skin. For those who listened, it sounded like madness. How could such a thing exist? But truth often sounds mad when it first returns from hell. The Allied soldiers who stumbled upon the camps at war's end were the next witnesses. What they saw defied their training, their faith, their comprehension. At Majdanek, they found crematoria still warm, shoes piled like mountains, and a smell that hung in the air like invisible smoke. Soviet troops who entered Sobibor's ruins found little but soil that refused to stay still. The ground was soft, gray, and strangely oily. When they dug, bones surfaced, buttons, teeth. They understood that they were walking on the skin of history itself. At first, they did not know what to call it. A labor camp, some said. A prison, others suggested. The term death camp had not yet entered language. Humanity had no vocabulary for what had been discovered. In Lublin, where the administration of Operation Reinhard had once sat behind neat desks, Soviet investigators uncovered papers that spoke in numbers and euphemisms. Special treatment, evacuation, action completed. To the bureaucrats who wrote them, these words had meaning. To the investigators reading them, they were codes for murder. Every memo, every train manifest, every ledger became a confession written in ink. The paper trail led from local offices to Berlin, to Himmler's commands, to Globoknik's reports of completed tasks. The documents did not show corpses, but they revealed something equally damning: the cold precision of a system built to kill without ever using the word. The survivors who remained found themselves caught between duty and despair. They had seen too much, lost too much, and now faced a world that did not want to hear them. When Samuel Willenberg, one of the few who escaped Treblinka, testified after the war, people wept, but others turned away. Some refused to believe. "It cannot be true," they said. "No people could do this." Denial became its own refuge, a shield against the unbearable. Survivors carried the burden of proof, walking embodiments of what humanity wanted to forget. They spoke at trials, in courtrooms thick with the smell of ink and cigarettes, recounting in meticulous detail what they had seen: the barbed wire, the false showers, the flames. They spoke not to condemn, but to remind. Their memories became evidence. Their nightmares turned into law. The first trials began even before Nuremberg. In Poland, local collaborators and guards were captured and questioned. Many claimed ignorance. "I was only following orders," they repeated, echoing the same phrase that would become the anthem of moral surrender. But the survivors knew the faces. They remembered who had shouted on the platform, who had laughed as the trains arrived, who had shot without blinking. Their testimonies turned those denials into ashes. Yet justice, like history, moved unevenly. Many perpetrators vanished into the chaos of post-war Europe. Some fled to South America. Others hid in plain sight under new names. For years, they lived quietly among neighbors who never asked questions. The earth had not only swallowed the dead, it had hidden the killers too. But memory, once awakened, is relentless. In the decades that followed, historians and prosecutors began to dig, not with shovels, but with persistence. They traced paper trails, interviewed witnesses, matched signatures to faces. One by one, the architects of Operation Reinhard were found. Franz Stangl, commandant of Treblinka, was captured in Brazil in 1967. When questioned about his role, he spoke calmly, almost politely. "My conscience is clear," he said. "I only managed the transportation." When pressed about the deaths, he grew irritated. "That was the system," he said. "It would have happened with or without me." But when asked about the smell of burning flesh, his voice faltered. That, he whispered, was something one could never forget. The reckoning of witnesses was not only about the guilty. It was about reclaiming truth from oblivion. In towns near the former camps, people who had once stayed silent began to speak. Farmers recalled the smoke. Railway workers remembered the trains. Children who had been told to stay away from certain forests confessed that they had gone anyway and had seen things they could not describe. The silence of the locals cracked, replaced by a flood of recollection. Each memory was a fragment of a shattered mirror, and when assembled, they revealed the full reflection of horror. Yet for every confession, there was denial. Some Germans, even years after the war, insisted that the camps were labor sites, not killing centers. Others claimed that the numbers were exaggerated, that the testimonies were lies. Neo-Nazis and revisionists would later weaponize that doubt, using the very absence of physical evidence, destroyed by the Nazis themselves, as a foundation for denial. But the witnesses endured. They carried within them the truth that could not be erased, and they repeated it until their dying breath. They told it in schools, in books, in courtrooms. They told it to anyone who would listen, because they understood that silence was the first step toward repetition. By the 1960s, the world began to listen more carefully. The Eichmann trial in Jerusalem pulled the Holocaust out of shadows and into the living rooms of millions. Survivors took the stand and spoke not in numbers, but in names. They described mothers, fathers, children, stories, not statistics. The effect was electric. The world began to understand that the Holocaust was not only history, it was human. And as the decades passed, memorials rose from the soil that the Nazis had once tried to erase. At Treblinka, a field of stone blocks was placed where the camp had stood, each one carved with the name of a lost town. At Sobibor, archaeologists uncovered the foundations of gas chambers once buried under trees. At Belzec, a walkway of black stone cuts through a mountain of ash, the path lined with the echoes of the dead. The earth had spoken, and finally, humanity listened. But memory is not a monument. It is a struggle. For every generation born after the war, the story of Operation Reinhard grows more distant, the photographs grainier, the voices fainter. The reckoning of witnesses must therefore continue, not just through survivors, who are now few, but through those who inherit their stories. Teachers, historians, filmmakers, descendants, they have become the new witnesses, keepers of a memory that demands to be felt, not just known. For them, the task is not only to recount history, but to resist its distortion. Because denial, like fascism, never dies, it waits. The reckoning was not only historical, it was moral. The world confronted a question that still burns. How could ordinary people commit such crimes? How could clerks, drivers, farmers, and officers become accomplices to genocide? The answers were found not in monsters, but in mirrors. The men of Operation Reinhard were not demons. They were human, frighteningly human. They believed in duty, in obedience, in order. They convinced themselves that cruelty was cleanliness, that murder was service, that silence was safety. The reckoning of witnesses forces us to see that evil rarely shouts. It whispers, it organizes, it rationalizes. It hides behind language, paperwork, uniforms. That realization was the truest punishment the world could offer. The exposure of the ordinary behind the unspeakable. When survivors grew old, their voices weakened but did not fade. Some recorded their stories for archives, sitting under bright lights, describing what they had seen with trembling hands. Others wrote books, their words plain and unadorned, as if afraid that beauty might betray truth. And when their testimonies were played to classrooms decades later, the silence that followed was not disbelief, it was reverence. Because the witnesses had become more than survivors. They had become the conscience of humanity. Even now, the reckoning continues in ways both visible and quiet. Archaeologists sift through soil once sown with lies, finding traces of foundations the SS had tried to erase. Historians match photographs to transport lists. The descendants of perpetrators wrestle with inherited guilt. The children of survivors wrestle with inherited pain. Memory has no expiration. It lingers, reshaping the living as much as it honors the dead. And in the forests of eastern Poland, where once there was only smoke and fear, the air is different now. It carries not silence, but remembrance. Birds nest where ashes once fell. Visitors walk softly through fields that seem peaceful, but are not. The ground hums faintly with history. Every step is a heartbeat of those who can no longer walk. The witnesses are fewer each year, but their truth has outlived them. It has become part of the world's marrow, a warning written in bone and fire. The reckoning of witnesses is not over. It may never be. It is renewed every time someone stands before the ruins and feels the weight of that silence. Every time a child asks, "How could this happen?" and an adult struggles to answer. It continues every time truth is defended against denial. Every time memory triumphs over indifference. The witnesses may be gone, but the responsibility they carried now belongs to all who remain. And perhaps that is the final echo of Operation Reinhard. Not the machinery, not the fire, not even the silence that followed, but the endurance of those who refused to let the truth die. The reckoning is eternal, not because justice was complete, but because memory must be. In the ashes of those who could not speak, the survivors found their voices. In the voices of those survivors, the world found its conscience. And in that conscience, fragile but unbroken, humanity found its chance to begin again. Chapter 13. The Trial of Memory. The war had ended, but the world did not yet understand what had truly been done. In the ruins of Europe, justice gathered its strength slowly, like a wounded animal learning to stand. Cities were in ashes, nations were hollow, and millions were missing, vanished without graves, without names, without explanation. What remained were rumors, fragments, numbers scrawled on walls, and the haunted eyes of those who had seen too much. From that darkness emerged the trials, the attempts of humankind to look its own reflection in the eye and not turn away. Yet the real trial was not held only in courtrooms. It was fought in the conscience of the world. It was the trial of memory itself. In Nuremberg, in 1945, the victors gathered to judge the defeated. The tribunal sat not only for the murderers, but for history. For the first time in the record of nations, men were charged not merely with crimes against enemies, but with crimes against humanity. The courtroom smelled of dust and tobacco, filled with translators whispering into headsets and stacks of documents reaching to the ceiling. Behind the glass booth sat men who had once commanded armies and industries, their uniforms traded for suits. They stared ahead, expressionless, as prosecutors spoke of millions murdered in silence. The evidence was overwhelming. Films of the camps, photographs of corpses, reports written in their own handwriting. And yet, even as the images were projected on the wall, the accused denied everything. They said they had known nothing, seen nothing, done nothing. They were only following orders. But Nuremberg could only judge so much. Operation Reinhard had been a ghost operation, its camps destroyed, its files burned, its commanders scattered. Few of those responsible stood in that courtroom. Odilo Globoknik, who had overseen the extermination, was dead by suicide. Christian Worth, the inspector of the camps, was killed by partisans. The others had vanished into the chaos of defeat, slipping through the cracks of a shattered continent. The great machine of death had dissolved into smoke. All that remained were fragments, ledgers, names, testimonies from a handful of survivors. The truth of Reinhard's crimes would take decades to surface, and when it did, it would come not from governments, but from memory itself. In the years after the war, Europe tried to forget. The people who had lived beside the killing fields wanted peace, not remembrance. The survivors were scattered across continents, building new lives out of ashes. Many kept silent, believing that words could not capture what they had seen. Others spoke and were met with disbelief. The enormity of their suffering was too vast for ordinary minds to accept. How could a factory of death exist in the heart of Europe? How could men design murder with blueprints and budgets? The truth sounded like fiction, and so, for a time, it was treated as such. But history has a way of resurfacing, like bones pushing through soil. In the 1950s, investigators in Germany began to reopen the cases of the extermination camps. It started with small questions, a missing person here, a survivor's letter there. Then came names whispered across borders: Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec. The files grew thicker. A prosecutor in Frankfurt, disturbed by rumors of forgotten crimes, began to collect testimonies. Survivors were summoned from Israel, from the United States, from displaced persons camps still filled with those who had nowhere else to go. They came carrying scars, photographs, and fragments of memory. They described the arrival platforms, the lies about showers, the screams, the smoke. They spoke of the SS men, Stengel, Franz, Hering, Wagner. The same names that had vanished after the war now returned like ghosts demanding recognition. The first major trials focused on Treblinka and Sobibor. They were held not in grand halls like Nuremberg, but in modest German courtrooms, where the smell of polished wood mixed with cigarette smoke. The accused sat behind glass, older now, their hair gray, their faces lined. Some smirked, others stared at the floor. The survivors faced them from the witness stand, trembling, voices cracking under the weight of memory. One described the day her child was torn from her arms. Another spoke of a guard who whistled as he shot people into pits. The courtroom fell silent, except for the sound of weeping. These were not statistics now. They were human beings, telling the world what it had tried to forget. Yet the trials revealed more than guilt. They revealed the complexity of evil. The defendants claimed obedience, duty, necessity. They said they had no choice. If I had refused, one said, I would have been killed. But the evidence showed otherwise. Some had volunteered for their posts. Others had profited from them. They drank, they joked, they wrote letters home. Their cruelty was not born of compulsion, but of convenience. They had become part of machines so vast that it made morality irrelevant. And that was perhaps the most terrifying discovery of all, that evil did not always come from monsters. It came from men who wanted to be efficient. The survivors were forced to relive their trauma in excruciating detail. They described smells, colors, voices, faces. They spoke of days when the sky burned and nights when silence was worse than screaming. Each testimony carved another wound, but they endured it because they knew the truth must be told. They were not only witnesses, they were the keepers of justice for those who could not speak. When verdicts were read and sentences handed down, some wept, others remained numb. There was no joy in seeing justice done. Justice, so late, felt like a shadow of what was owed. But still, it was something, a record, a recognition, a refusal to let the dead vanish again. The trial of memory extended beyond the courtroom. In literature, art, and film, people began to confront what the camps had done to the soul of humanity. Books like Night and Survival in Auschwitz gave voice to the silence. Artists painted landscapes of gray and ash. Filmmakers documented the ruins, silent forests where the earth still breathed softly beneath the surface. The world began to learn what it had ignored. Yet even as the truth emerged, denial followed close behind. Some said the numbers were exaggerated. Some said the camps were propaganda. Others said it was time to move on. For every witness who spoke, there was someone eager to silence them. But memory cannot be legislated. It cannot be ordered to rest. The survivors aged, but their testimonies grew stronger with time. In schools, children were shown photographs of Treblinka's field of stones. In museums, artifacts from the camps, shoes, glasses, a single child's toy, were displayed behind glass, silent but eloquent. The public began to understand that remembrance was not just about the past. It was a safeguard for the future. To forget was to invite repetition. And so, remembrance became a kind of justice. Endless, imperfect, but necessary. In 1961, the world watched as Adolf Eichmann, one of the architects of deportation, stood trial in Jerusalem. Behind the glass booth sat a man who looked ordinary, almost meek. But as survivors took the stand and told their stories, the ordinariness shattered. The courtroom became a theater of truth, where memory triumphed over bureaucracy. The world could no longer claim ignorance. The television cameras broadcast the faces of the witnesses, their trembling hands, their cracked voices. The Holocaust, once hidden in shadows, entered every living room. It was no longer history. It was humanity confronting itself. For those connected to Operation Reinhard, the search for justice continued long after Eichmann's hanging. Franz Stangl was arrested in Brazil in the late 60s, tried in Dusseldorf, and sentenced to life imprisonment. He defended himself to the end, claiming he had never killed anyone personally. "My hands are clean," he said. But even in his cell, he could not escape the stench of the past. He admitted that he had known what was happening, that he had overseen the transports, that he had measured the efficiency of death by the hour. When asked what he felt when he saw the corpses, he hesitated. "It was my job," he whispered. That sentence became the epitaph of an entire generation of killers, the bureaucracy of death distilled into 4 words. In Poland, at the sites where the camps once stood, memorials began to rise. At Treblinka, stones replaced graves, each one carved with the name of a town that had vanished. At Sobibor, excavations revealed the outlines of gas chambers the Nazis had tried to erase. At Belzec, a monument of dark basalt split the earth like an open wound. Visitors walked the paths in silence, their footsteps echoing through history. These places were not ruins. They were reminders. They stood as proof that even if the perpetrators had tried to burn the evidence, the memory had survived in the soil, in the bones, in the stories passed from one generation to the next. The trial of memory, however, did not end with the death of the last Nazi. It continues still, in classrooms, in documentaries, in the whispers of survivors' descendants who bear the inherited weight of grief. Every denial, every attempt to distort the truth becomes another trial. Every retelling, every remembrance becomes another verdict. The witnesses grow fewer each year, but their testimonies remain indestructible, encoded in history's conscience. For the men and women who lived through it, memory was both punishment and purpose. They carried it like a scar, painful, permanent, but proof that they had survived. Some could never speak of it again. Others devoted their lives to telling it. Their stories became the moral compass of a century that had lost its way. They taught that justice is not always found in punishment, but in remembrance. They proved that even when humanity falls into darkness, the act of remembering is an act of defiance. As the decades passed, the world changed, but the lesson did not. Genocide would occur again, in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, and each time, the echoes of Operation Reinhard returned. The words, "never again," were carved in stone, but stones are silent. The real promise must live in people. The trial of memory is not about the past. It is about vigilance. It demands that we recognize the warning signs, the language of dehumanization, the comfort of obedience, the ease of forgetting. It asks us to look into history's mirror and see not monsters, but ourselves, capable of both cruelty and courage. When the last witnesses finally left this world, they passed on their memory like a torch, fragile and burning. The task now belongs to those who are not there, to carry the flame forward. Because the true justice for Operation Reinhard does not lie in the execution of murderers or the construction of monuments. It lies in the refusal to let memory die. The trial never ends. It is renewed each time a student reads the words of a survivor, each time a visitor stands before the stones of Treblinka, each time someone says the names that the killers tried to erase. The trial of memory is eternal. It judges not only the guilty, but the living. It asks a single question that echoes through time. Will you remember? And in answering it, humanity decides what kind of future it deserves. Chapter 14. The Ghosts of the Ash Fields. Time has a strange way of softening the edges of horror, but some places resist forgetting. The forests of eastern Poland, where the camps of Operation Reinhard once stood, still breathe uneasily. In the early morning light, mist rises from the ground like ghosts unsure of where to go. Birds fly over fields that were once furnaces. The soil looks ordinary, but beneath its surface lies the trace of something human. Bone, ash, memory. It has been decades since the fires were extinguished, but the air still carries a weight, as though it remembers. These are the ghost fields of Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, places where the world tried to bury its own conscience. And though the buildings are gone, though the perpetrators are dead, the ground itself refuses peace. When the war ended, there was nothing left of the camps. The Nazis had plowed them over, planted trees, and built farmhouses on top of graves. The goal was simple: erase the evidence. But erasure is never perfect. Farmers who plowed those fields in the late 40s found fragments of bone in their furrows. Children playing in the woods stumbled upon teeth and bits of metal. During the rains, the soil bled gray, the minerals of ash rising to the surface. The villagers spoke in whispers. They said the earth was cursed. Cows refused to graze near the old fences. Dogs howled for no reason. At night, the wind seemed to echo voices, unintelligible, soft, pleading. People avoided those places not out of superstition, but out of instinct. Some places remember more than they should. In the first years after the war, the fields remained untouched. Governments were rebuilding cities, not forests. The camps were remote, accessible only by narrow roads that few traveled. But the survivors did not forget. Those who had escaped returned quietly, walking the paths where their families had vanished. They found no markers, no graves, no signs, only trees where there should have been barracks, grass where there had been fire. Many wept not only for the dead but for the silence. The Nazis had taken everything: lives, names, evidence, even the right to mourn. One survivor of Treblinka wrote, "It is as if the world has closed the lid and walked away." But the lid did not stay closed for long. By the late 1950s, historians and locals began to dig, not for treasure, but for truth. At Belzec, investigators found a strange layer beneath the soil, thick and greasy, unlike normal dirt. Tests revealed it to be human fat mixed with ash. Beneath it, they found bone fragments so small they could have been mistaken for gravel. The remains of thousands lay compressed into a single stratum of earth. In Sobibor, archaeologists uncovered traces of the gas chamber's foundations, brick outlines where death had been organized with mathematical precision. And at Treblinka, they discovered the shape of the old railway ramp, the path that had led hundreds of thousands to their final breath. Every discovery was like reopening a wound that had never healed. The locals who had lived beside these places carried their own memories, complex and uneasy. Some had profited during the war, scavenging from the belongings of the dead. Others had tried to help in secret, hiding escapees, smuggling food. Most had done nothing, paralyzed by fear, struggling to survive themselves. After the war, they avoided the subject. The land was both home and graveyard, a place of shame and survival intertwined. When investigators came asking questions, many turned them away. "It's better not to disturb the dead," they said. But the dead had already been disturbed. They had been burned, scattered, denied. Now they wanted acknowledgement, not rest. Over the years, the fields of the extermination camps transformed into memorials, but not easily. In the 1960s, the Polish government began to construct monuments. The designs were austere, abstract, stone, concrete, voids. There were no crosses, no statues of soldiers, no triumph. Only silence made solid. At Treblinka, hundreds of jagged stones were planted across the clearing, each representing a destroyed Jewish community. No names, only places, a map of absence carved into the earth. At Belzec, a long black path cuts through a mountain of crushed rock, the walls rising on either side like the sides of a grave. Visitors walk in darkness until they reach a small clearing, where the horizon opens and the sky seems painfully bright. Sobibor's memorial is quieter still, a single sculpture of ash and flame, surrounded by birch trees that sway gently in the wind. These are not places of comfort. They are mirrors. Even as memorials rose, the ghosts did not rest. In the spring of 1963, heavy rain near Sobibor washed away topsoil, revealing bones and bits of burned clothing. Children brought them to their teachers. Archaeologists were called again. Each excavation brought new evidence: wedding rings fused by fire, teeth, shards of glass from perfume bottles, coins engraved with Hebrew letters. These were the personal relics of the dead, intimate and indestructible. They were proof that humanity had lived here once, that love and laughter had existed even in the shadow of annihilation. It was said that to walk through these sites was to feel a vibration underfoot, as if the ground itself was humming with memory. For decades, the ghosts remained silent witnesses. They appeared not as apparitions, but as sensations, an unease that visitors could not explain. Survivors who returned often said they felt watched, not by the living, but by the past. "They are here," one man whispered at Treblinka's memorial, his voice trembling. "They're still here." He didn't mean spirits in the traditional sense. He meant presence, the weight of lives unacknowledged, of grief unresolved. Standing on that soil, one could sense that something immense and invisible was pressing upward from below. The dead were not gone. They were part of the land now, part of the air. The ghosts of the ash fields do not haunt with malice. They remind. They insist on remembrance. When wind moves through the memorial stones at Treblinka, it sounds like whispering, a chorus of voices that refuse silence. At night, when the moonlight touches the black stones of Belzec, they gleam faintly, as if sweating from the weight of history. Every visitor becomes a participant in the act of witnessing. To walk those paths is to hear the echoes of footsteps that once ran in terror, to smell faint traces of smoke that linger in imagination more than in air. The ghosts demand not pity, but presence. As time passes, the survivors die, and the living inherit the memory. Each generation must find its own language for the unspeakable. For some, the memorials are sacred spaces. For others, they are history lessons carved in stone. But for those who listen closely, the ash fields speak in subtler tones. They warn of what happens when civilization replaces conscience with obedience, when bureaucracy becomes bloodless, when the value of life is measured in efficiency. They remind that the line between order and atrocity is thinner than we think, and that the soil beneath our feet can turn from cradle to grave in an instant. In recent years, archaeologists have continued to study the sites, using technology that can see beneath the surface without disturbing it. Ground-penetrating radar reveals patterns, rectangular anomalies marking mass graves, circular traces of burned wood where pyres once stood. Each discovery confirms what the survivors had said all along. The ghosts were not metaphor. They were evidence waiting to be acknowledged. Scientists handle these sites like living beings, careful not to violate them. The earth is treated as testimony. Every layer of ash, every shard of bone, every particle of dust is a witness. And yet, even with proof beneath their feet, there are those who deny. Holocaust denial has grown like a weed in the shadow of these memorials, fueled by ignorance and malice. Denial is not disbelief, it is desecration. It is another attempt at erasure. But the ghosts of the ash fields cannot be denied. They exist in the data, in the DNA, in the collective memory of those who have stood in those places and felt history breathing beside them. The deniers may speak loudly, but the silence of the dead speaks louder still. Every year, thousands of visitors come to these fields, students, historians, descendants, strangers. Some kneel to touch the soil. Others weep quietly. A few can only stand still, overwhelmed. There is a strange paradox to these places. They are both empty and full. Empty of life, full of presence. Walking through them, one senses that time does not move forward here. It circles endlessly, looping back to that moment when the train stopped, when the gates opened, when the sky filled with smoke. It is as if the camps still exist in a parallel layer of reality, invisible but permanent. The ghosts have no faces, no words, no bodies left. But they have stories. They exist in every photograph of a lost family, every letter that ends mid-sentence, every prayer whispered in the dark. They exist in the absence they left behind, in the towns without Jews, in the synagogues turned to ruins, in the melodies that no one remembers how to sing. The ghosts of the ash fields are not confined to Poland. They drift through time, haunting the conscience of every nation that looked away, every government that hesitated, every neighbor who stayed silent. In the quiet of early morning, when mist clings to the memorial stones and sunlight filters through the trees, one can almost imagine them standing there, not as phantoms, but as witnesses. Thousands upon thousands, each a fragment of a world destroyed. They do not accuse. They do not forgive. They simply exist, asking the same question that has echoed since the fires died. Will you remember us? To remember is not to dwell on the past. It is to guard the future. The ghosts of the ash fields are not only the dead. They are warnings made visible. They remind humanity what happens when apathy becomes policy, when prejudice becomes law, when obedience becomes virtue. Their silence is not absence. It is the loudest voice imaginable, a voice that says, never again. But the phrase means nothing if it is not lived. Never again is not a slogan. It is a responsibility. It is the promise carried by every visitor who leaves those fields with tears in their eyes and dust on their shoes. As twilight falls over Treblinka, the air cools and the stones cast long shadows. The forest seems to hold its breath. For a moment, everything stands still, the trees, the sky, the earth. Then a breeze stirs, rustling through the grass, whispering over the stones. It sounds like a sigh, or perhaps a prayer. It is not imagination. It is memory. The ghosts of the ash fields are speaking again, softly but clearly, to those who will listen. And their message, unchanged through all the years, is simple. Remember what was done here. Remember who we were. Remember, and guard the living world from ever becoming this again. Chapter 15. The Echoes That Never Fade. There are places in history where time seems to stop, where the air feels too heavy to carry the weight of what was done there. The story of Operation Reinhard ended long ago in the physical world. The camps dismantled, the perpetrators dead, the ashes scattered, but its echoes never faded. They linger not only in the soil of Poland but in the collective memory of humanity, a vibration that hums quietly beneath every conversation about good and evil, silence and courage, memory and denial. History may be written in books, but this history breathes. It whispers in classrooms. It weeps in memorials. It calls out in the voices of those who swore that forgetting would be the final crime. For decades, the world tried to move forward, to rebuild and modernize, to look to the future rather than back into the abyss. But the abyss never stopped staring back. Every generation since the war has had to decide what to do with the ghosts that remain. The photographs, the testimonies, the moral questions that no verdict could ever close. The Holocaust was not just a wound in Jewish history. It was a wound in human civilization. And the scars of Operation Reinhard. Those 3 camps built with chilling efficiency to annihilate the Polish Jews became symbols of the darkest potential hidden within ordinary men. The survivors aged, their voices softening, but never losing strength. In their last years, they began to speak with greater urgency, as if racing against the clock of mortality. They visited schools, universities, museums, telling children about what it meant to arrive at a place where human life was measured in minutes. They spoke of deception, of the false train stations, the flowers planted by the gas chambers, the kindness of guards that lasted only until the doors closed. And every time they told the story, they asked the same question: what will you do when we are gone? Because they knew that memory, like freedom, is fragile. It survives only through the living. By the late 20th century, the ghosts of Operation Reinhard had become part of global consciousness. Scholars studied the logistics, the rail networks, the administrative orders, and the psychology of the perpetrators. Museums displayed piles of shoes, stacks of hair, fragments of personal belongings that spoke louder than any statistic. Films and documentaries began to bring the faces of the victims back to life, giving humanity to the numbers. Yet, even as the story became known, its meaning continued to evolve. The question was no longer only how it happened, but how people allowed it to happen. How millions of ordinary citizens could live beside death factories and still eat, work, and sleep. The echoes of the camps reach far beyond Poland. They resonate in debates about power, obedience, and moral responsibility. When soldiers today are ordered to commit atrocities, when bureaucracies justify cruelty with language, when societies dehumanize those they fear, the echo is there, a faint reminder of trains departing under the sound of official paperwork. The story of Operation Reinhard teaches that evil is not always shouted. Often, it is whispered, signed, filed, and stamped. The killers of Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka did not see themselves as villains. They were workers, administrators, officers, people who believed they were serving order. That is why remembering them is not just about horror. It is about recognition. Every anniversary of liberation brings with it ceremonies of remembrance. Politicians give speeches. Survivors light candles. Rabbis recite prayers for the dead. But the most powerful moments are often the quiet ones. A granddaughter of a survivor, standing in Treblinka's clearing, feeling the wind against her skin. A historian in Belzec, kneeling to touch the soil that still gleams faintly with ash. A teacher showing a class a black and white photograph of smiling faces taken just weeks before they vanished. These are the small acts that keep the echo alive. They do not restore what was lost, but they ensure that the silence never wins. The ghosts of Operation Reinhard are not just Jewish ghosts. Among the victims were Roma, Poles, Soviet prisoners, and others deemed unworthy by a system that measured worth by ideology. Their stories remind us that hatred never stays confined. The machinery of annihilation built for one group can be turned on another with ease. The Holocaust was a singular event, but the lesson it carries is universal. Once people begin to think of others as less than human, the descent into murder becomes frighteningly simple. That truth hangs like a warning over every generation that follows. The sites themselves, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, have changed. Once, they were hidden behind forests and lies. Now, they are open wounds made visible. Each memorial is different, but they share a strange serenity. There are no walls, no barbed wire, no guards. Only stones, paths, and sky. The absence is what speaks. Visitors come from every part of the world, moving slowly through the silence, whispering prayers or nothing at all. Children ask questions their parents cannot answer. The guides speak softly, as if afraid to disturb something sacred. Every sound, a footstep, a breath, feels amplified, as though the air itself has memory. Some say that remembrance is a kind of resurrection, but the truth is darker and more beautiful. To remember is not to bring the dead back. It is to acknowledge that they never truly left. The ashes of Operation Reinhard mingle with the roots of trees, the rain, the rivers. They nourish the earth. The ghosts are part of everything that grows there now. Every blade of grass, every drop of dew, every whisper of wind is part of their afterlife. That is the paradox of remembrance. It is both mourning and continuity. The killers try to turn human beings into nothing, but in the end, they became part of everything. As decades turned into centuries, the question of how to tell this story remains as urgent as ever. The more distant it becomes, the easier it is for people to treat it as history, a lesson rather than a warning. But Operation Reinhard was not an ancient atrocity. It was an act of modernity. It was carried out with trains, files, telephones, typewriters, and planning meetings. It was industrial murder. And in a world still filled with technology and bureaucracy, its lessons remain terrifyingly relevant. When technology obeys ideology without question, when systems operate without conscience, history does not need to repeat itself. It simply adapts. The echoes of the death camps can also be heard in the stories of those who fought back. Not only the uprisings of Sobibor and Treblinka, but the small, almost invisible acts of defiance. A mother comforting her child in a gas chamber so the child would not be afraid. A prisoner writing a note and burying it in a bottle for the future to find. A railway worker leaving a mark on a train car, a silent prayer scratched into steel. These moments of humanity, fleeting but real, are proof that even in the center of annihilation, the human spirit resisted extinction. The Nazis destroyed bodies, but not souls. The echoes of those souls are what we still hear today. There's a story told by one of the last survivors of Sobibor. When asked how he survived, he said, "I did not survive alone. The dead carried me." He meant that memory itself had become his strength, that every friend he had lost became a reason to live, to speak, to bear witness. That is what the ghosts of the ash fields do. They carry us forward. They remind us that silence is complicity, that indifference is not neutrality. They call out across time, asking us not to avenge them, but to honor them through vigilance, empathy, and truth. Today, the echoes of Operation Reinhard reach far beyond history books and memorials. They exist in the struggle against hate speech, in the defense of human rights, in the courage of those who refuse to look away when others suffer. The lessons of Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka are not confined to the past. They're the moral compass of the present. When refugees are dehumanized, when prejudice becomes policy, when indifference meets injustice, the ghosts stir again. Their silence grows heavy, as if reminding us that the past is never truly past. The final chapter of Operation Reinhard is not written in blood or stone, but in memory itself. It lives wherever people choose to remember, not with despair, but with determination. To walk through Treblinka today is to feel the dual presence of death and life. Flowers grow where bodies once burned. Children laugh in the distance, their voices carried on the wind. The world did not end there. It continued, scarred but alive. And that, perhaps, is the greatest victory over those who sought to erase it. As dusk falls over the memorials, the light fades into gold, then gray. The stones cast long shadows, stretching across the earth like the memory of those who once stood there. The air cools, and for a brief moment, everything feels still. Then a breeze rises, a faint, almost imperceptible sound. It moves through the trees, across the paths, over the fields of ash. If you listen closely, it sounds like breathing, like the world itself, remembering. The echoes of Operation Reinhard are not gone. They are alive in every act of remembrance, every story told, every promise made to protect the living from the darkness that once consumed the world. The ghosts no longer ask for vengeance. They ask for vigilance. They do not want tears. They want truth. They do not demand pity. They demand presence. And as long as their story is told, as long as one person walks through those silent fields and listens to the wind, their echoes will never fade. Because memory, once awakened, never truly dies. It only waits for someone to hear it again. And in that sound, faint but eternal, humanity finds not only its shame, but also its redemption.